Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I never used to believe in the supernatural, or whatever you want to call the things people say live in the woods, but after what happened at Hollow Pine last summer, I don't know what to believe anymore. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just me, my cousin Pete, and our buddy Tyler spending a few days off-grid, fishing and getting away from it all. Hollow Pine was miles away from the nearest town, a dense and tangled forest that sprawled over hills and cliffs. It was mostly untouched, isolated and wild, exactly what we were looking for. It felt like our little secret, a piece of nature we could call our own. Tyler knew the place well. He'd camped there with his dad growing up, so we trusted him to guide us to the best spots. The first 2 days went by in a blur of fishing, beer, and laughter. We found a clearing with a perfect view of the river, pitched our tents, and settled in. At night, we'd gather around the fire, telling ghost stories and jokes, the darkness beyond the flickering flames swallowing our laughter whole. On the third day, we decided to explore a bit further to see if we could find a better fishing spot upstream. Tyler led the way, hacking at the underbrush with a machete while Pete and I followed close behind. We trekked deeper into the woods, the trail narrowing until it was almost non-existent, just a thin line of trampled weeds and roots. That's when we found the cabin. It seemed abandoned, old, its wooden planks blackened with age and neglect. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze. We should have left it alone. We all knew that. But there was something magnetic about it, like the cabin was pulling us closer, urging us to look inside. Tyler, always the brave one, pushed the door open with a nudge of his boot. "Just want to take a quick peek," he said with a grin. We followed him in, our curiosity outweighing our better judgment. The cabin was bare, just a single room with a dusty wooden floor, a rusty old stove, and piles of rotting blankets in one corner. But it was the markings on the walls that caught our attention. Carved into the wood, in haphazard violent slashes, were strange symbols. Circles with lines through them, triangles interlocking, almost like a code or a language we couldn't read. They covered every inch of the walls, floor to ceiling. "What do you think they mean?" Pete asked, his voice low, reverent. "I don't know, man," Tyler replied. "Could be anything, maybe a hunter's lodge or some old trapper camp." But I wasn't so sure. The symbols seemed deliberate, ritualistic, like they had a purpose beyond decoration. The air in the cabin felt heavy, like the place was filled with a presence we couldn't see, but could almost feel. And that's when we heard it, a faint scratching noise like nails dragging across wood, coming from beneath the floorboards. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Pete nodded, his face pale, and Tyler crouched down, pressing his ear to the floor. The sound continued, a slow, deliberate scraping, as if something was trapped below us, clawing to get out. Without thinking, Tyler started prying at the boards with his machete, wedging it between the cracks and lifting them up. The smell hit us first, putrid, decaying, like rotting meat left in the sun. And then we saw it. A hole, carved out of the earth beneath the cabin, just large enough to fit a person. And inside, bones. Dozens of them piled on top of one another, like someone, or something, had been collecting them for years. They weren't just animal bones either. There were human skulls, shattered and broken, ribs, femurs, all arranged in a twisted, chaotic pattern. "Let's get out of here," Pete said, his voice quivering. "Now." Tyler nodded and we bolted out of the cabin back into the woods. We ran blindly, branches whipping at our faces, stumbling over roots and rocks. We didn't stop until we were back at our campsite, panting and out of breath. "What the hell was that?" I asked, but nobody had an answer. We all agreed to pack up and leave the next morning. Whatever we'd found in that cabin, it wasn't something we wanted to be near. That night we tried to sleep, but the forest was alive with noises, the distant rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches, and something else. A low, guttural growling, moving in circles around our campsite. It sounded like an animal, but there was something wrong with it. It was too deep, too human, like a person trying to imitate a wolf's howl. And then the whispering began. It came from the trees, from all directions at once, 1,000 voices speaking in unison, saying things we couldn't understand but felt in our bones. The symbols from the cabin flashed in my mind, over and over until they felt burned into my brain. "Do you hear that?" Pete hissed, and Tyler nodded, his face pale and sweat-slicked. We sat in the dark, knives clutched in our shaking hands, waiting for the dawn. Eventually the growling stopped and the whispering faded, leaving an eerie silence that stretched until the first light of morning. As soon as it was bright enough to see, we packed up camp, our eyes darting nervously at every sound, every shadow. We hit the trail fast, walking as quickly as we could, the woods pressing in on all sides. But after a couple of hours, it became clear we were lost. The trail was gone, swallowed by the forest, and the landscape around us seemed unfamiliar, like the woods had shifted overnight. "What the hell?" Tyler muttered, spinning in circles, searching for any sign of the path. That's when we saw him. A figure standing just a few yards away, half concealed by the trees. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall, gaunt, wearing ragged clothing that hung off his bony frame. But it was his eyes that stopped me cold, milky white, like they'd been drained of life, staring right at us without blinking. "Hey!" Tyler called out, waving his hand. "You okay, man? We're lost. Can you help us?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, he took a step closer, and that's when I saw the symbols carved into his skin. They were the same symbols from the cabin, etched deep into his flesh, crisscrossing his face, his arms, his chest. His mouth hung open, slack, and a low, guttural growl escaped his throat, the same growl we'd heard last night. "Run," Pete whispered, and we did. We ran like hell, crashing through the underbrush, pushing deeper into the forest without any idea of where we were going. The man followed, moving faster than seemed possible, his long limbs snapping as he chased us, the growl growing louder and more distorted, like a predator closing in on its prey. I don't remember how long we ran, hours maybe. But eventually we broke through the trees and stumbled out onto a dirt road where an old ranger's truck was parked. We banged on the doors, screaming for help until the ranger, a middle-aged woman with a concerned look, jumped out and asked us what was wrong. We babbled out our story, but she didn't seem surprised. Instead, she just shook her head and said, "You boys were in Hollow Pine, weren't you? Should have known better. That place, well, it's not like the rest of the forest." She drove us back to town, and we never looked back. But here's the part that haunts me. 2 weeks later, Tyler went missing. I got a call from his mom saying he'd vanished without a trace, no note, no signs of struggle. The last place anyone saw him was at a bar, telling some guys about our trip to Hollow Pine. And just yesterday, when I was out on a hike to clear my mind, I found something tucked into the fork of a tree by the trail, a piece of old, faded paper with a symbol carved into it. One of the same symbols from the cabin. Now every time I close my eyes, I see those markings, burned into the backs of my eyelids. And I hear that growling, echoing in the distance, coming closer and closer each night. I don't know if Tyler's still out there, but sometimes when I wake in the middle of the night, I hear whispers coming from outside my window, and I know I'll never go back to Hollow Pine again. At least, not on my own. I've camped plenty of times before, but Coldwater Canyon was supposed to be different, more remote, wilder. Mia and I wanted an escape from everything, a place where the world couldn't reach us. No phones, no stress, no noise. The online reviews were sparse, but the ones we found all described it as breathtakingly beautiful, isolated, peaceful. We never saw that side of it. The first red flag should have been the town, a little place called Fenlo, about an hour's drive from the canyon. When we stopped for supplies, the locals stared at us like we didn't belong, their eyes narrowing as we pulled into the gas station. It was unnerving. An older man behind the counter glanced at our camping gear and shook his head. He didn't say anything at first, just scanned the items with a slow, deliberate movement before he finally spoke, in a voice barely louder than a whisper. "You going up to Coldwater?" he asked. Mia smiled, oblivious. "Yeah, we've been planning this trip for weeks." The man's face darkened. "Don't stay there after dark," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "Things ain't right up there." We laughed it off in the car, calling him a superstitious old man. Every small town has its myths, we figured. But there was something in the way he said it, something that stuck with me as we drove the long, winding road deeper into the mountains. The trees grew thicker, the air cooler. Soon, the road narrowed to a dirt path, and Coldwater Canyon welcomed us with towering cliffs and a thick forest that seemed to swallow the light. We set up camp in a clearing by the creek, the air crisp and clean. The sound of rushing water was soothing, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Mia was in her element, laughing as we gathered wood for the fire and talked about the long hike we'd planned for the next day. It felt like we were the only two people left in the world. As the sun began to set, a strange unease crept over me. It started with small things. The way the wind moved through the trees. It had a low, mournful quality, almost like a voice whispering in the distance. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the silence between the wind gusts felt heavy, pressing in on us. I didn't say anything to Mia. I didn't want to spoil the mood. The first night passed without incident, though I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear a faint rustling just outside the tent. Not like an animal. It was too slow, too deliberate. Mia was out cold, oblivious to my growing anxiety, and by morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just nerves. We spent the day hiking up to the ridge, the view from the top stunning, almost enough to push the previous night's worries from my mind. Almost. But something about the forest below felt wrong. The trees, so densely packed together, seemed to move, shift in ways they shouldn't. It was like the forest was watching us. When I mentioned it to Mia, she laughed and said I was being paranoid. That night things got worse. It started around midnight. We were sitting by the fire, watching the flames crackle and pop when Mia froze, staring into the woods. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I hadn't, not at first. But when I listened closely, there it was, a faint tapping, like someone knocking on wood. It was rhythmic, coming from deep within the forest, and it grew louder, closer, with each tap. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the trees, but there was nothing. Just the dense, impenetrable wall of pine and shadow. Tap, tap, tap. The sound stopped. The forest was silent, except for the crackling fire and the soft trickle of the creek nearby. Mia was on edge now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there just beyond the light watching us. Then, out of nowhere, Mia gasped. She pointed toward the edge of the clearing, her hand trembling. I followed her gaze and saw it. Eyes. Reflective, unblinking eyes staring at us from the tree line. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote. But these eyes were wrong. They were too high off the ground, too wide apart, and they didn't move, didn't blink. Just stared. We both stood frozen, the fire casting flickering shadows across the clearing, but the eyes didn't flinch. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly backed away, pulling Mia with me toward the tent. I didn't dare look away from the tree line, but as we retreated, the eyes remained fixed on us, glowing faintly in the firelight. We zipped ourselves into the tent, our breaths shallow, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. I whispered to Mia that it was probably just an animal, trying to convince her as much as myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't an animal. It was something else. The tapping resumed. It was closer now, just outside the tent, circling us. Tap, tap, tap. Each knock was measured, deliberate, as if something or someone was toying with us. Mia gripped my hand so tightly it hurt, but I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. Then came the scratching. Soft at first, like nails dragging across the nylon fabric of the tent. It moved slowly, methodically, tracing the edges of the tent. Mia's eyes were wide, tears pooling in the corners, but we were both too terrified to move. The scratching stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I don't know. Time seemed to stretch on forever, and we stayed frozen in place, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. It never came. By dawn, the forest seemed normal again. The birds were chirping, the wind had returned, and the sun filtered through the trees like everything was fine. But the unease lingered. Neither of us talked about what had happened. We didn't need to. We both knew something was wrong with Coldwater Canyon. We packed up in silence, ready to leave as quickly as possible. But as we began the hike back toward the car, we noticed something strange. The trail, the one we had followed in so easily, was different. It wound in directions we didn't recognize, twisting through unfamiliar parts of the forest. Landmarks we had passed the day before were missing, as if the forest had shifted in the night. Panic set in quickly. We hiked for hours, but no matter which way we went, we couldn't find the trailhead. The sun was high in the sky, but the deeper we went into the woods, the darker it seemed to get, the trees growing thicker and more oppressive. And then we saw it. Carved into the trunks of several trees were symbols, strange angular shapes like runes. They were old, weathered, but clearly deliberate, and the further we walked, the more we saw, scattered throughout the forest, marking the trees like a warning. The tapping returned. It was closer this time, echoing through the woods, coming from every direction. Mia and I spun around, our eyes wide with fear, but there was no one there. Nothing. Just the trees, the symbols, and the sound. And then we saw the eyes again, dozens of them, lurking in the shadows between the trees, glowing faintly in the dim light. They watched us, unblinking, unrelenting. This time there was no doubt. They weren't animals. They were waiting. We ran. Branches tore at our clothes, our skin, but we didn't care. We just ran, our breath ragged, our hearts pounding in our chests. The eyes followed, keeping pace with us, always just out of sight, just beyond the next tree. By some miracle, we stumbled onto the road. I don't remember how we got there, but we didn't stop. We ran until we saw the car, threw our gear inside, and sped out of Coldwater Canyon, never looking back. We didn't speak for the entire drive back, but I knew Mia felt it too. The lingering presence, the sense that we had barely escaped something ancient, something wrong. I still see the eyes sometimes in my dreams, staring at me from the shadows, waiting. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, monsters, and all that otherworldly stuff were just stories people told around campfires, right? That's what I thought. Until that night in Clearwater Forest. Me, Sam, Rachel, and Ben had been hiking through the woods for 2 days, exploring trails that only the most experienced hikers dared venture onto. The forest was huge, dense, and old, with a feeling like it had never been touched by human hands. Just endless trees and silence, the kind of silence that presses on your ears after a while, making you feel like something's wrong. We found a great spot to camp on the second night, near a small creek that flowed between the towering pines. The sun was setting, and we were ready to sit around the fire, roast marshmallows, and trade stories. That's when Sam first mentioned the Mirror Man. "There's a legend about this forest," Sam said, his face half lit by the flickering flames. "About a man who lives deep in the woods. He's not quite human. Or at least, not anymore. Rachel rolled her eyes. Come on, Sam. Save the campfire ghost stories for the kids. Ben laughed, but I could see a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. So what's the deal? This guy just lives out here? Why Mirror Man? Sam leaned forward, lowering his voice. The story goes that if you're alone in these woods after dark and you look into a reflective surface, water, a mirror, anything, he shows up. He looks just like you, at first. But then you notice something's off. His smile is too wide, his eyes too dark. And once you see him, he starts following you. First in your reflection, then in the real world. Sounds like a dumb urban legend, I said, tossing a stick into the fire. Let's not scare ourselves when we've still got a couple more days out here. Sam shrugged, smirking. Hey, don't believe me, but they say if you break eye contact with the Mirror Man, he gets closer. If you ignore him long enough, well, you don't come back out of the forest. There was a heavy silence after that. I don't know why, but the idea of it stuck with me. Maybe it was how seriously Sam had told the story, or maybe it was just the growing sense of unease that had been creeping up on me since we entered the woods. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of something crunching outside the tent. It was faint, barely noticeable over the soft breeze through the trees, but it was enough to jolt me awake. I listened, holding my breath. There it was again, a slow, deliberate footstep, like someone was walking around our camp. I sat up, glancing over at the others. Ben was snoring lightly, and Rachel and Sam were both fast asleep. I grabbed my flashlight, careful not to make too much noise, and slipped out of the tent. The night air was cold and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. I swept the beam of the flashlight around the campsite, scanning the trees. Nothing, no movement, no sound except the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. But as I turned toward the creek, something caught my eye, something in the water. A reflection. I moved closer, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The creek's surface was still, perfectly reflecting the moon and the trees. And there, standing on the opposite bank, was a figure. I froze. It was me, my reflection. But I wasn't standing on the other side of the creek. I was on this side. I lifted my hand slowly, and the figure in the water did the same. But there was something wrong with it. The movement was delayed, just by a second, like it was copying me but not quite in sync. And then it smiled. Not a normal smile. No, this smile stretched too wide, pulling the skin tight across its face, revealing too many teeth. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back, but the reflection stayed there, grinning up at me from the water. I turned, backing away from the creek, but something told me not to take my eyes off the reflection. Sam's story flooded back into my mind. Don't break eye contact. The figure in the water stepped forward, out of sync with me now, moving on its own. My breath came in shallow, rapid bursts. I couldn't run, I couldn't scream. I was frozen, staring at this thing that was wearing my face but wasn't me. Then it whispered, its voice soft and distant like it was carried on the wind. You shouldn't have looked. I blinked. And the moment I did, the figure was gone. The water rippled as if something had just stepped out of it. I spun around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing, just the dark forest, silent and suffocating. I rushed back to the tent, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't wake the others. I didn't tell them what I saw. Who would believe me? It was probably just a nightmare, right? My mind playing tricks on me after Sam's stupid story. But the next morning, when we packed up and started hiking again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt different. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle in the trees sent a jolt of fear through me. And then, around midday, I noticed something strange. Whenever we passed a pool of water, a shiny rock, or anything reflective, I saw it. My reflection. But it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It moved before I did, its eyes too dark, its smile lingering just a little too long. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself I was just tired, just paranoid. But that night after we set up camp again, it got worse. I went to the creek to fill my water bottle, and there it was again, standing just on the edge of the water, looking up at me. The same twisted grin, the same hollow eyes. Only now, it wasn't just in the water. It was on the surface, stepping out, as if it were climbing out of a mirror. I ran back to camp, my mind racing. Sam's story was just that, a story. It couldn't be real, but deep down, I knew it was. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing it out of the corner of my eye, in the reflection of my water bottle, in the shine of my phone screen, always watching, always smiling. The next morning I tried to tell the others, but they just laughed it off. Sam said I was taking his story too seriously, and Rachel teased me about letting the mirror man get in my head. Even Ben told me to lighten up, but I could see it. I could see it watching us in every reflection, always a little closer than before. That night was the worst. We were sitting around the fire talking and laughing when I saw it. In the reflection of Ben's glasses just over his shoulder, my face but twisted, grinning, standing right behind him. I jumped up screaming, but by the time they turned around, it was gone. "We're leaving," I said, my voice shaking. "We have to get out of here." They didn't argue after that. The fear in my voice must have convinced them, or maybe they'd felt it too, the growing sense of dread in the woods. We packed up in a hurry and started hiking out, even though it was late and dark. But no matter how fast we walked, I could feel it following us, watching from the reflections in the trees, in the puddles, in our gear. Closer, always closer. We never made it back to the car. The last thing I remember is turning around and seeing them, the twisted, grinning faces of my friends. Only they weren't my friends anymore. They were reflections, hollow and wrong, stepping out of the shadows with those horrible, stretched smiles. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was alone. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I don't know how long it's been since then. Days? Weeks? Time doesn't seem to work right here. The trees never end. The sun never fully rises, and I can't escape. Sometimes I see myself in the reflections, grinning, waiting. Sometimes I hear my friends' voices calling from the trees. But I know it's not them, it's him, the mirror man, and he's never going to let me leave. The forest always had a way of swallowing sound, but tonight it felt like it was swallowing everything. I was deep in the Ouachita National Forest, far enough away from civilization that even the faintest remnants of city noise didn't reach. I liked it that way, quiet, isolated. This was my escape, a weekend camping trip to clear my mind. I'd done it dozens of times before, but something about this trip felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but the moment I set up camp, I felt off, like I didn't belong here. The air was too still, and the usual chorus of insects and birds was absent. The quiet was almost expectant. I had arrived late, later than I'd wanted, thanks to a wrong turn and a few miles of rocky, overgrown trails that nearly swallowed my Jeep. By the time I got my tent pitched and a fire going, the sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving the forest cloaked in darkness. The flames crackled, sending sparks into the air, but the warmth didn't bring me the usual comfort. I sat close to the fire, listening for any sounds, but there was nothing. Just an overwhelming, suffocating silence. Even the wind seemed to avoid this part of the woods. It was then I first heard the voice. "Help!" It was faint, almost lost in the flicker of the flames, but unmistakable. I stood up, heart thudding in my chest, straining to hear. "Help me." It came again, a soft, distant cry, a woman's voice, fragile and weak, echoing from somewhere in the trees. My flashlight swept over the dense forest, illuminating nothing but an endless sea of branches and shadows. I knew better than to go wandering into the woods at night, especially in unfamiliar terrain, but something about that voice gnawed at me. It sounded desperate, broken. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the sound. The deeper I went into the forest, the thicker the air became. The trees, once tall and majestic, now felt like towering walls closing in on me. My footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles, and the farther I ventured, the more oppressive the silence became. "Help, please." The voice grew closer, but something about it was off. It didn't fluctuate, didn't change direction, as if it were coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I slowed my pace, anxiety creeping up my spine. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. Nothing, just that heavy, suffocating quiet, and then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight. A woman, dressed in pale, tattered clothing, her back to me. She was thin, almost unnaturally so, her limbs long and frail. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, taking a cautious step closer. She didn't respond, didn't even flinch, just stood there motionless as if she hadn't heard me at all. I raised the flashlight higher, and that's when I saw her face, or what was left of it. Her head jerked toward me with a sickening snap, her eyes hollow and sunken, her skin stretched tight over bone, peeling in places, and her mouth, it was wide, too wide, like someone had torn her jaw open at the corners. She stared at me, her lips trembling as though trying to speak, but the only sound that escaped was that same soft cry. "Help me." I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams across her figure, and then she was gone, vanished into the trees, as if she'd never been there at all. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. I had to go back to camp. I had to leave. But when I turned around, the path was gone. The trees were different now, closer, gnarled, twisted in unnatural ways. There was no trail, no sign of where I'd come from. Panic set in as I realized I had no idea where I was. The forest had shifted, rearranged itself around me, and then the whispers started. Soft, unintelligible at first, like the wind moving through the trees, but it wasn't the wind. The whispers were all around me, just beyond the reach of the light, voices overlapping in a chorus of unintelligible murmurs. I spun in a slow circle, the flashlight beam barely piercing the suffocating darkness. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, figures slipping between the trees. Too many to count, too fast to focus on. "Please help me." That voice again, but now it wasn't just one, it was many. The same pleading cry, over and over, coming from all directions. I started running. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The flashlight swung wildly in my hand, its beam cutting through the thick blackness. But no matter how fast I ran, the whispers followed. Louder now, more insistent. The ground beneath my feet became uneven. Roots and rocks tripping me up as I stumbled deeper into the forest. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. That's when I saw it, a cabin sitting in the middle of a small clearing, its windows dark and empty, like lifeless eyes staring out at me. It wasn't on any map I'd studied, and I knew it shouldn't be here. But I had no other choice. I ran toward it, the whispers growing louder, closer. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The cabin was cold, the air inside stale, as though it had been abandoned for years. My flashlight flickered again, but I didn't care. I collapsed against the door, breathing hard, listening. Silence. For the first time since I'd left camp, the forest was silent. I stood up, shining the flashlight around the small room. It was empty. No furniture, no signs of life. Just a single door at the far end of the room, slightly ajar, leading to what I assumed was a back room. I don't know why I opened it. I should have left, should have run. But something drew me to it, like a moth to a flame. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. My stomach dropped, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave, but my feet moved forward anyway, carrying me down the steps. The basement was colder than the rest of the cabin, the air thick and damp. My flashlight beam swept over the stone walls, revealing nothing but shadows. And then I saw it. A figure hunched in the corner facing the wall. It was human, or at least it had been at one point, but its skin was mottled, gray and decayed, patches of hair clinging to its scalp in uneven tufts. It rocked back and forth, muttering something under its breath. "Please, help me." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, the figure turned its head, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't just one person. It was many. Dozens of faces twisted and fused together, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide and unseeing. The whispers erupted, louder than ever, filling the room with a cacophony of voices, all saying the same thing. "Help me." I backed up, my legs trembling, but before I could reach the stairs, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the thing in the corner began to rise. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling through the forest, the whispers fading behind me as I ran. Somehow, I found my way back to camp, though I don't know how. The trees had shifted again, the path reappearing as if the forest itself had let me go. I packed up my gear in a frenzy, not caring about the time or the darkness. I just needed to leave, to get out of those woods and never come back. As I drove away, the whispers still echoed in my ears, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, I swore I saw the woman again, standing at the edge of the trees, her hollow eyes watching me leave. I haven't been back since, but sometimes late at night I still hear them. "Help me." And I know deep down that the forest isn't done with me yet. We were looking for something different, something to shake off the monotony of our lives back in the city. A remote camping trip, far from technology, far from the humdrum of urban life, seemed like the perfect idea. So, I joined Alex, Mia, and Logan for a weekend deep in the Ironwood National Forest. It wasn't a popular spot. In fact, most people I talked to didn't even know it existed. I should have taken that as a warning. We arrived at Ironwood late in the afternoon. The road was nothing more than a narrow dirt path barely visible through the thick brush. No signs, no markers, just endless trees. The deeper we drove, the more the forest seemed to close in on us. Still, we were excited. The isolation was what we wanted. No distractions, no people. Just us and nature. The trail ended in a large circular clearing surrounded by towering pines that cast long shadows over the campsite. It looked unnatural, almost like someone had carved the space out of the forest on purpose. But we didn't dwell on it. Instead, we unloaded the car, set up our tents, and got a fire going as dusk settled in. The first strange thing happened almost immediately. Logan, always the jokester, had been tossing sticks into the fire, trying to see how many he could land on top of the burning logs. Then, out of nowhere, he stopped. He was standing near the edge of the clearing, just staring out into the trees. "What's up?" Mia asked, noticing his sudden silence. He didn't answer at first. He just stood there motionless, peering into the woods. I walked over to him, nudging his shoulder. "Logan?" I thought I saw someone," he muttered, shaking his head like he was trying to snap out of a daze. I followed his gaze into the forest. Nothing, just trees and the growing darkness. "There's no one out here but us," I said, trying to laugh it off. "Maybe you've been working too hard. You're seeing things." Logan chuckled weakly, but I could see the unease in his eyes. "Yeah, probably just my imagination." We all settled back around the fire, talking and joking, trying to push away the odd feeling that hung over the clearing. But as the night deepened, the sense of isolation grew heavier, oppressive. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the tents, and the forest beyond was impossibly dark. That's when we heard it. A soft rustling like footsteps coming from the tree line. It was slow, deliberate, too rhythmic to be an animal. We all went silent, exchanging uneasy glances. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered, her voice tight. Alex, who had been poking at the fire with a stick, nodded slowly. "Yeah." Logan stood up, scanning the edge of the clearing with narrowed eyes. "Maybe it's another camper?" In the middle of nowhere, I replied. We're miles from the nearest trail. Who the hell would be out here? As if to answer my question, the rustling grew louder, closer. It circled us just beyond the firelight, moving through the trees in a wide arc around the clearing. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my skin crawling with the sensation of being watched. Whatever it is, it's messing with us, Logan muttered, grabbing a flashlight. I'm going to check it out. Before anyone could stop him, he strode toward the tree line, shining the light into the trees. The rest of us stood up, instinctively moving closer to the fire. The warmth suddenly felt like the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. See anything? Alex called out, his voice tense. Logan didn't answer. He was standing still again, just like before, the flashlight beam sweeping through the trees, catching nothing but branches and shadows. Then he started walking forward, disappearing into the woods. "Logan, wait!" Mia shouted, but he was already gone, swallowed by the forest. I grabbed my own flashlight and hurried after him, the others following close behind. The moment we stepped past the tree line, the clearing seemed to vanish. The trees were thick, their branches knitting together overhead, blocking out the moonlight. The air felt colder, heavier. "Logan!" I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the silence. Nothing, just the rustling of leaves and then, faintly, the sound of footsteps ahead. We followed the sound, pushing through the underbrush, our flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could feel the others' growing panic. After a few minutes, we found him. Logan was standing in the middle of a narrow trail, his back to us, staring at something ahead. "What the hell, man?" Alex said, grabbing Logan's shoulder. "You can't just wander off like that." Logan didn't move, didn't even flinch. "Logan?" I stepped in front of him, shining my flashlight in his face. His eyes were wide, unfocused, like he wasn't even seeing us. I followed his gaze, turning my flashlight toward the path ahead. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A figure standing between the trees, tall and thin. Too thin. Its limbs were long, almost unnaturally so, its skin pale and stretched tight across its bones. But it wasn't the figure itself that sent ice down my spine, it was its eyes. They were huge, black, and reflective, like mirrors, catching the light from my flashlight and throwing it back at me. It was just standing there watching us. "Logan, come on," I whispered, grabbing his arm and tugging him back. He blinked, snapping out of his trance, and stumbled backward, his face pale. What is that?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head slightly tilted, those reflective eyes locked on us. "We need to go," Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." None of us argued. We turned and hurried back down the trail. Logan still dazed, Mia and Alex casting nervous glances over their shoulders every few seconds. I kept my flashlight trained on the ground, too afraid to look back. We stumbled into the clearing, breathless, and collapsed by the fire. The oppressive feeling of being watched was still there, heavier than before. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see those black, mirror-like eyes staring back at us. "Did you see it?" Logan finally whispered, his voice shaky. "That thing?" We all nodded, none of us willing to put it into words. We just sat there, huddled close to the fire, staring into the flames, too terrified to even consider going to sleep. The rustling started again. This time it was louder, more insistent, like something was circling us faster, closer. We all stood up, flashlights flickering toward the sound, but we couldn't see anything, just the trees, the shadows, and the darkness beyond. Then the whispers began. They were soft, almost unintelligible, coming from every direction at once, faint voices murmuring just at the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew, deep down, that they weren't human. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely steady. "Now." We didn't pack up, we didn't care. We grabbed what we could, our bags, our lights, and we ran. Through the trees, stumbling over roots and rocks, not daring to look back. The whispers followed us, growing louder with every step, and in the corner of my eye, I kept seeing them, those tall, thin figures, standing just beyond the edge of the light, their black eyes reflecting the moonlight. We made it back to the car just as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. We didn't speak, didn't stop to breathe until we were miles away from Ironwood, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror. None of us ever talked about what happened that night. We pretended it was just a bad dream, a trick of the mind. But I know the truth. I know what I saw. And I know they're still out there, in that clearing, watching, waiting. I can still hear the whispers. I've always been a rational person. You know the type. Grounded, logical, a firm believer in things that can be seen, touched, and explained. So when my girlfriend Claire suggested we take a weekend camping trip to an old, nearly abandoned state park, I didn't think twice. I loved the idea of getting away, deep into the woods, just the two of us. Little did I know, those woods had something waiting for us, something I can't explain. The park was tucked away, miles off any major road. It used to be popular decades ago, but the state rerouted the main highway and the place slowly withered away. Only the diehard campers or locals went there anymore. That sounded perfect to me. No noisy crowds, just nature and quiet. We arrived mid-afternoon, parking our car at the small gravel lot near the ranger station. The building was old, weathered, with no one inside. A faded map of the park was pinned to a bulletin board, but most of the trails were overgrown or unmarked. Claire was excited, and I could feel that sense of adventure kicking in. We grabbed our gear and set off down one of the more accessible trails, winding through the thick forest. The trees were massive, their branches intertwined so densely that the sunlight barely filtered through. It was eerie but beautiful, and the isolation was exactly what we'd been looking for. After hiking for a couple of hours, we found a spot near a creek, a small clearing just big enough for our tent. We set up camp, the sound of the flowing water calming and constant. As the sun sank lower, casting the forest in hues of gold and shadow, I gathered wood for a fire, while Claire laid out some snacks. Everything was going perfectly. Too perfectly. The first sign that something was off came as night fell. The fire was crackling, the air was cool but comfortable, and we were just talking about random things. Life, work, future plans. That's when we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint, almost like a stick tapping against a tree. I thought it was just the wind at first, but then it came again, 3 slow taps. Silence. Then 3 more. "Did you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice low. I nodded, looking around. The forest, once filled with the sounds of birds and insects, had gone dead silent. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just the tapping. "Maybe it's a woodpecker," I offered, trying to keep the mood light, though something in my gut felt wrong. Woodpeckers don't tap like that. The tapping continued, steady, methodical, as if it was coming from all around us. Claire stood looking into the trees, her face pale in the firelight. "That's not an animal," she whispered. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the woods. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, revealing only more trees, gnarled and ancient. No movement, no animals, nothing. The tapping stopped, just like that. I sighed in relief, chuckling nervously. "See? Probably nothing." But Claire didn't laugh. Her eyes were fixed on something just beyond the firelight. I followed her gaze, shining the flashlight over, but saw nothing unusual. "What is it?" I asked. I thought I saw something," she murmured. "Something big." I scoffed, though my skin prickled. "Big? Like a deer?" She shook her head. "No, taller, much taller." I wanted to dismiss it. My rational brain kicked in, reminding me that people often see shapes in the shadows, especially in the woods at night. It's just tricks of the light, our minds playing games with us. But something in Claire's voice made me feel uneasy. She wasn't the type to scare easily. I tried to change the subject, suggesting we eat, maybe have a drink, but Claire stayed uneasy, her eyes darting to the trees every few seconds. The fire seemed to shrink, even as I fed it more wood, as if the darkness was pressing closer. That's when we heard it again, the tapping. But this time it was louder, closer, and there was something else. A voice, faint, almost like a whisper carried on the breeze. "Claire?" We both froze. The voice was soft, distant, but unmistakably calling her name. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered, her hand gripping my arm tightly. I nodded, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Yeah, I did." "Who's out there?" I yelled into the darkness, trying to sound braver than I felt. But no one answered. The tapping stopped, replaced by a stillness that was even more unsettling. "Let's just pack up and go," Claire said suddenly, her voice trembling. "I don't want to stay here anymore." I nodded in agreement. The uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at me was now a full-blown alarm. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what it was. We started packing quickly, but as we did, something moved in the trees. A shadow, tall and gangly, just at the edge of our vision. I turned my flashlight toward it, but it vanished behind the trees. Too fast, too quiet. "Did you see that?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer. My heart was pounding, and all I could think about was getting out of there. We grabbed our gear, leaving the fire burning, and started down the trail, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. As we walked, the forest around us seemed to change. The trees felt closer, their branches twisting overhead like claws reaching for us. The air grew colder, heavier, and the silence was oppressive. Every step felt like we were being watched. And then we heard it again. The tapping. It was louder now, echoing through the trees, and the voice came with it, closer, clearer. "Claire, come back." Claire squeezed my hand, her breathing shallow, her eyes wide with fear. "Who the hell is that?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The voice, it sounded wrong, too flat, too hollow, like someone trying to imitate a person, but not quite getting it right. We quickened our pace, practically running down the trail, but the tapping followed us, growing louder and faster, keeping pace with us. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. Something tall, impossibly tall, moving through the trees. It didn't walk. It glided, silent and smooth, its limbs too long, its body too thin. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Claire's arm, and we bolted down the trail, the tapping now a frantic beat behind us like a drum echoing in the night. We didn't stop running until we burst out of the trees and into the parking lot, panting and drenched in sweat. The tapping had stopped, but the silence remained, thick and unnatural. I fumbled with the car keys, throwing our gear into the trunk as quickly as possible. Claire was already in the passenger seat, her face pale, her hands shaking. I started the car and we peeled out of the lot, gravel spraying behind us. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woods were dark, impenetrable. But just at the edge of the trees, standing perfectly still, was a figure. Tall, thin, watching us. I haven't been camping since that night. I haven't told anyone else about what we saw. Claire won't talk about it either, but sometimes late at night when the world is quiet and dark, I can still hear it. The tapping, steady, rhythmic. And sometimes just on the edge of sleep I hear the voice calling my name. I had always prided myself on being able to handle solitude. I thrived in it, really. It cleared my head and helped me think. So, when the idea of a solo camping trip hit me, it seemed like a perfect way to unwind. No distractions, no noise, just me and the wilderness. It was something I had always wanted to try, but I hadn't gotten around to it. Until now. I chose a spot I'd read about in some backcountry forums, one of those hidden gem locations that only serious hikers knew about. No marked trails, no campgrounds, just pure wilderness. The directions were simple enough. Head down an old logging road until it dead ends, hike west for a couple of hours, and you'll find a small lake surrounded by dense forest. I was sold. The drive took most of the day. As the road got rougher, I saw fewer signs of civilization until there was nothing but trees and sky. I reached the end of the logging road as the sun was beginning to set. With the last bit of daylight, I grabbed my pack and headed into the forest, following the vague directions I had printed out. By the time I found the lake, the sun had sunk low and the sky was a deep orange. The lake was small, almost perfectly round, its water dark and still, reflecting the towering pines that surrounded it. It was beautiful, isolated, perfect. I set up camp quickly, pitched my tent, and got a small fire going just as the last light faded from the sky. The forest around me was quiet, eerily quiet. There were no birds, no rustling of small animals, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional ripple on the lake's surface. I figured it was just because I was so deep in the woods, far from any trails or people. The animals were probably more cautious around here. As I sat by the fire eating my dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence felt too thick, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I told myself I was just adjusting to being alone in such a remote place. I wasn't used to this level of quiet. Still, it gnawed at me, that sense of something being slightly wrong. After a couple of hours of staring into the flames, I decided to turn in for the night. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped up my sleeping bag. The night was utterly black outside, the kind of dark where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. I lay there, listening to the nothingness, trying to let the steady rhythm of my breathing lull me to sleep. And then I heard it, a soft splash. My heart jumped and I strained my ears listening for more. At first I told myself it was just something falling into the lake, a fish maybe, but then it came again. Another splash followed by the faintest sound of something shifting, like wet fabric being dragged across the ground. I sat up, my pulse racing, ears straining to pick up any sound. The forest outside was still pitch black, the fire long since extinguished. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it toward the lake. Nothing. The water was still, like glass. The trees stood tall and silent, their reflections unbroken in the dark mirror of the lake. But that sound, it hadn't been my imagination. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response, just the steady hum of the wind through the pines. I scanned the beam of my flashlight across the shore, expecting to see an animal or maybe a tree branch that had fallen into the water, but everything looked untouched. I shook my head, trying to calm myself down. I'd been on edge all day, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Satisfied that there was nothing out there, I lay back down and tried to get comfortable again. But just as I started to relax, I heard it again. This time it was closer. A soft, deliberate splash followed by the distinct sound of something moving along the shore. Slow, wet footsteps. They stopped just beyond my tent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. I gripped the flashlight tightly in my hand, the beam still off as I lay there, listening to whatever was outside. For a moment there was silence, then a soft brushing sound like fabric dragging against the canvas of my tent. It was right outside. My mind raced. What was it? A bear? No, bears don't move like that. A person. But why would anyone be out here, at this hour, in a place so remote? And then I heard it. A voice. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Help. Me. It was a whisper, strained and distant, but it was there, just on the other side of the tent wall. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to do. Everything in me screamed to unzip the tent and run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The voice came again, this time closer. "Help! Me! Please!" I sat up, my hands trembling, and flicked on the flashlight. I aimed it toward the tent flap, ready to confront whatever, or whoever, was out there. But the voice had fallen silent again. With shaking hands, I unzipped the tent, just enough to shine the flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the shore of the lake. But there was nothing. No person. No animal. Nothing. The water was as still as ever, the trees unmoving. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I scanned the area again with the flashlight, feeling my heart pound in my chest, and that's when I saw it, something glistening on the ground near the edge of the lake. I stepped out of the tent cautiously, my body tense, and approached the spot, keeping the flashlight steady. The closer I got, the more I could see. It was a wet, dark patch in the dirt, like something had been dragged out of the water and across the shore. The trail led to the lake, and as my eyes followed the path, I saw something floating just beneath the surface of the water. A face, pale, bloated, staring up at me with empty, lifeless eyes. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, my mind reeling. The figure in the water didn't move, didn't blink, just floated there, half submerged, staring at me from the depths. I ran back to the tent, grabbing my pack and yanking it on. I didn't care about the rest of my gear. I didn't care about the fire or the tent. I just needed to get out of there. As I sprinted toward the forest, I heard it again behind me from the lake. "Help me." The voice was louder this time, more desperate. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran, but by the time I reached my truck, the sun was just beginning to rise. I jumped in, slammed the door, and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I was miles away from that lake. I haven't been back to that spot since. I don't tell anyone the full story when they ask why I've stopped camping alone. They wouldn't believe me if I did. But I still hear that voice sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment. Help me. I've always been a sucker for a good adventure, especially when it involved getting away from the noise of the city and disappearing into the wilderness. So when my brother, Tom, suggested a weekend camping trip in the remote forests of northern Maine, I didn't hesitate. He'd found a place deep in the woods, untouched by hikers or tourists, far from any civilization. A perfect escape. We packed light, just the essentials: food, water, tent, a couple of flashlights. No cell service that far out, of course, but that's what we wanted. A break from the modern world. The first day of hiking was beautiful. Dense forest stretched for miles in every direction, the trees towering above us like ancient sentinels, their branches knitting together to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight. The air smelled of pine and earth, clean and crisp. We walked for hours, finally reaching a small clearing by a pristine lake just as the sun began to set. It was the kind of place you only see in postcards. We set up camp, built a fire, and spent the evening trading stories and laughing. The forest was alive with the usual sounds: leaves rustling, crickets chirping, the occasional owl hooting in the distance. Nothing out of the ordinary. As night fell, the temperature dropped, but the fire kept us warm. Everything felt peaceful, perfect. But that night, things started to get strange. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. The fire had burned down to embers and the forest had gone completely silent. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead. No wind, no crickets, no rustling leaves. Just an oppressive, unnatural stillness. I sat up, blinking in the darkness, listening. Then I heard it. A soft, barely audible whisper carried on what little breeze there was. At first I thought it was Tom talking in his sleep, but when I listened more closely, the voice wasn't coming from his tent. It was coming from the trees, from the forest itself. "I hear you." The whisper was faint, like it was being carried from far away, but it was there. I froze, my heart beginning to pound. I told myself it had to be the wind, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me after a long day of hiking. But then it came again, clearer this time. I see you. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on and shining the beam toward the tree line. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. I stood up, scanning the area around our camp. Everything looked normal. But that voice, it didn't sound like it belonged out here. It didn't sound like it belonged anywhere. I walked over to Tom's tent, my hand shaking slightly, and unzipped it just enough to see him curled up, fast asleep. It definitely wasn't him. I know you. The voice was closer now, like it was moving through the trees, weaving its way toward me. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned the flashlight off, hoping the darkness would somehow hide me. I crouched down by the embers of the fire, straining to hear, to make sense of the whispers. For a moment there was silence again, but then the wind picked up just a little, and with it came more voices. Not just one now, several. All whispering, all calling. It was as if the forest had come alive with the sound, like the wind itself had learned to speak. I see you. I hear you. We're waiting. My skin crawled. The whispers seemed to be everywhere, surrounding me, but every time I looked, there was nothing. I started to panic, my heart racing. I wanted to wake Tom to tell him we needed to leave, but some primal instinct kept me rooted to the spot. It felt like if I moved, if I made a sound, whatever was out there, whatever was whispering, would know. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the voices faded, carried away on the wind as suddenly as they had come. The silence returned, thick and heavy, but this time it felt like a relief. I crawled back into my tent, forcing myself to breathe slowly, to calm down. I convinced myself it had just been the wind playing tricks on me. It had to be. The forest was full of strange noises at night, right? I lay there staring up at the roof of the tent, waiting for sleep to take me again. The next morning Tom woke up cheerful, completely unaware of what had happened. I didn't mention the whispers. I didn't want to sound like I was losing it. Instead, we packed up and decided to explore the area around the lake. It was a beautiful day, sunlight filtering through the trees, the air crisp and clear. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting between the trees. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, we found ourselves at the edge of an old trail, overgrown and barely visible. Tom wanted to follow it, see where it led, but I wasn't so sure. The uneasy feeling I'd had all day was growing stronger, like a knot tightening in my stomach. "Come on," Tom said, grinning. "Let's see where it goes. Could be something cool." Against my better judgment, I followed him. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser, the air cooler. The further we went, the more I felt like we were being watched. The whispers from the night before echoed in the back of my mind, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. After about an hour, we came across a clearing. At the center stood the remains of an old, weathered cabin, its walls collapsed and overgrown with vines. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, maybe longer. "Wow," Tom said, stepping closer. "This is amazing. How did this even get out here?" I didn't answer. I was too focused on the strange feeling that was creeping over me, the sense that we weren't supposed to be here. As we explored the cabin, I found something strange. Carved into the wooden beams were symbols, strange, looping patterns and spirals that didn't make any sense. Some looked like animals, others like faces, twisted and distorted. They weren't anything I recognized. And then I heard the whisper again. "I know you." It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, unmistakable. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the corners of the cabin. Nothing, just rotting wood and shadows. "We should go," I said, my voice shaking slightly. Tom frowned at me. "What's wrong with you? It's just an old cabin." "We need to go now. I insisted, backing toward the edge of the clearing. The air had changed. It was heavier, colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker. That's when the wind picked up again, and with it came the voices. I see you. I hear you. We're waiting. This time Tom heard it too. He froze, his eyes wide, and looked at me. What the hell is that? I don't know, I whispered, but we need to get out of here. We didn't waste any more time. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, following the barely visible trail back toward the lake. The whispers followed us, growing louder, more insistent. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the voices with it, like the forest itself was alive, like it was chasing us. By the time we reached our campsite, the voices had faded again, but the feeling of being watched never left. We packed up and left that day. Neither of us spoke much on the drive home, and we never went back to that part of the woods. I still don't know what those voices were, or why they were calling to us. But every now and then, when I'm alone in the quiet of the night, I swear I can hear them again, whispering, waiting. I shouldn't have agreed to come here. I knew something was off the moment I set foot in these woods, but when my friend suggested a weekend camping trip to the Black Rock Wilderness, I didn't want to be the one to ruin the fun. Now, sitting alone in my tent, the fire dwindling outside, I can't shake the feeling that we're not alone out here. There are no other campers for miles. This part of the park is notorious for being remote, hard to reach. That's why we chose it. No crowds, no noise, just us, nature, and endless forest, and whatever else lurks in it. The first day was fine. We set up camp, had a few beers, and shared stories around the fire. But as the night wore on, the woods grew eerily quiet. No crickets, no owls, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional snap of a twig. We laughed it off, saying it was probably just deer or some other harmless animal moving in the brush. But deep down I could feel it, the wrongness, and we first noticed it around midnight. Paul, who had wandered off to relieve himself, came back pale, his face drawn tight. He didn't say much, just muttered something about seeing a coyote too close to camp. But when I pressed him, he shook his head, refusing to explain further. Then came the voices. It started as we were preparing to turn in for the night, distant, echoing through the trees, but unmistakably human. A man's voice calling out for help. We froze, listening. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, clutching her sleeping bag tighter. "Probably someone lost," Paul said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Could be another group of campers. But we hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day. The voice came again, this time closer. "Help." It was faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but the desperation in it was real. It sent chills down my spine. "I'll go check it out," Matt said, grabbing his flashlight. He was always the brave one, the first to volunteer for anything risky. The rest of us exchanged nervous glances, but no one protested. We didn't want to seem paranoid. Matt disappeared into the dark trees, his flashlight beam cutting through the thick shadows. The forest swallowed him up, and soon the sound of his footsteps faded into nothing. Minutes passed, then an hour. No sign of Matt. No more voices. "Shouldn't he be back by now?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. We tried calling out for him, but there was no response. Just silence, thick and oppressive, pressing in on us from all sides. Paul stood up, pacing near the fire, clearly on edge. "Maybe he got lost. I'll go look for him." "No," I said quickly. "We shouldn't split up again. Let's wait a little longer." Paul reluctantly agreed, but I could see the unease growing in his eyes. We all felt it. Something was wrong out there. Another hour passed and still nothing. The fire was burning low, casting long, flickering shadows across the camp. Then suddenly, from the darkness, we heard it. "Hey, guys." It was Matt's voice coming from the woods. I shot to my feet. "Matt, where are you?" The voice was closer now, just beyond the edge of the firelight. "I'm over here." I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the trees. But there was nothing, just the still, dark forest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Matt, come into the light," I called, my voice shaking slightly. "We can't see you." Silence. Then, after a long pause, the voice came again. "Help me." It was Matt's voice, but wrong. The tone was off, flat and emotionless, like someone trying to mimic him but not quite getting it right. My stomach churned. Paul stepped forward, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I whispered. "Something's not right." Paul shook me off, his face twisted with frustration. "It's Matt. He's probably hurt. We have to help him." He turned and marched toward the sound, his flashlight sweeping through the trees. I followed him, heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. Sarah stayed by the fire, eyes wide with fear. "Matt," Paul called out as we stepped into the woods, "where are you, man?" There was no response. Just when I thought maybe Paul had been right, maybe Matt was injured and disoriented, we heard the voice again, this time from behind us. "I'm over here." We spun around, shining the flashlight in the direction we'd just come from. But there was nothing there. My skin crawled. "We need to go back," I said, grabbing Paul's arm again. "Now." Paul hesitated, the confusion clear in his eyes. But before he could say anything, a figure emerged from the shadows, just at the edge of the light. It was Matt, but not. His movements were jerky, wrong, like a puppet on strings. His face was pale, almost waxen, and his eyes, God, his eyes, were black pits, reflecting nothing of the light around us. He stood there, swaying slightly, his mouth hanging open as though he was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. Then that voice came again, but it didn't come from his mouth. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, echoing all around us. "Help me." Paul took a step back, his face draining of color. "Matt?" The figure that looked like Matt tilted its head, as if considering the question, but didn't respond. Instead, it slowly raised one arm and pointed deeper into the forest. "Come with me." I backed away, pulling Paul with me. My heart was racing, my mind screaming that this wasn't real, this couldn't be real, but there it was, standing in front of us. Something that looked like our friend, but wasn't him, couldn't be him. "Run," I whispered, barely able to get the word out. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush back toward the camp. Behind us, I heard that voice again, distant, but still too close. "Come with me." We burst back into the campsite, gasping for breath. But when we arrived, the fire had gone out. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," Paul yelled, spinning in circles, searching the dark. Then from the trees her voice came, faint, soft. "I'm over here." I grabbed Paul's arm, forcing him to stay put. "No," I said firmly. "That's not her. It's not her." Paul looked at me, terror filling his eyes. He knew I was right. He could feel it too. We didn't sleep that night. We just sat there, huddled in the cold darkness, waiting for the sun to rise. The voices kept coming, circling the camp, first Matt's, then Sarah's. Sometimes closer, sometimes further away, always calling, always asking for us to follow. "Help me. Come with me." By morning, we were both too exhausted to speak. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, we packed up camp in silence, our eyes hollow, our minds reeling. We didn't speak of what we saw, of what we heard. We just walked, leaving the cursed place behind. We never found Sarah or Matt. When we finally made it back to the ranger station, I told the ranger everything. I expected him to be shocked, maybe even call for a search party. But he just looked at me, his face expressionless, and said, "You're lucky you made it out." That's when I realized he knew. He'd always known. We weren't the first. We wouldn't be the last. And whatever's out there in those deep woods, it's still waiting. I've always loved the idea of camping alone, just me, the stars, and the open wilderness. It's peaceful, it's freeing. Or at least, that's what I used to think. It was late October when I decided to spend a weekend camping in the northern stretch of the Rockies, far from any town or well-traveled trail. A friend told me about a spot, a hidden gem, deep within the national park where no one goes. No tourists, no crowds, just nature. I'd been working non-stop and needed a break, so I thought this would be the perfect escape. The drive up was long, the roads winding, and the last few miles were barely more than a dirt track leading deeper into the dense forest. I reached the trailhead just before dusk, grabbed my pack, and headed out. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places like it hadn't been used in years. My excitement was tinged with a slight unease, but I shrugged it off. Solitude was the whole point. After a couple of hours of hiking, I found the perfect clearing, surrounded by tall pines with a small creek trickling nearby. The sunset was casting an orange glow through the trees, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. I pitched my tent, got a fire going, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. That's when the first sound came, and it was subtle at first, barely noticeable over the crackle of the fire. A distant rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I figured it was just a deer or a raccoon, common enough in these parts, but it kept getting closer, slowly, methodically, like whatever it was circling me. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything. No glowing eyes, no movement. Just trees. I tried to shake it off, but my nerves were on edge. I'd been in the woods enough to know that animals get curious, especially when there's food involved, so I put out the fire and retreated into my tent, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. Hours passed, but I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside had my heart racing. I kept telling myself it was just nature, just the forest, until I heard a voice. It was faint, distant, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded human. My stomach twisted into knots. There was no way anyone else could be out here. This area was too remote, too difficult to reach. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening as the voice grew louder, closer. It wasn't a normal voice. There was something wrong with it. The tone, the pitch. It was almost mimicking the cadence of speech without actual words. Then, all at once, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I waited, every muscle tensed, waiting for some kind of explanation, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no more voices, just the oppressive quiet of the woods. And then came the tapping. It was soft at first, a light, repetitive tap, tap, tap against the side of my tent. My blood turned to ice. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, praying it was just a branch or some animal brushing against the nylon. But the tapping moved. It slid from one side of the tent to the other, circling, deliberate. Whatever it was testing me. I held my breath, flashlight shaking in my hand, and slowly unzipped the tent, just a crack. I don't know what I expected to see, maybe a raccoon, maybe a trick of the wind. But what I saw was worse. There, just outside the tent, crouched in the dim glow of the flashlight, was a figure. At first it looked like a person, hunched over, as if inspecting my campsite. But something about its shape was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent at unnatural angles. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tightly over its bones. I froze. My mind raced to make sense of it, but there was no logical explanation for what I was seeing. The figure's head snapped up, and for the briefest moment, I caught a glimpse of its face. It wasn't human. Its eyes were too wide, too dark, and its mouth was too large, stretching unnaturally across its face in a grotesque grin. And then, in a voice that sounded like it had been ripped from a nightmare, it spoke. "Help me." The words were garbled, wrong, like they were being forced through a mouth not designed for speech. It sounded like a sick imitation of human language, as if it had been practicing. I scrambled backward, kicking at the tent, desperate to get away. The creature stood up, impossibly tall, its limbs contorting as it rose and began to move toward me. Its movements were jerky, like it was learning how to walk for the first time. I bolted. I didn't even bother with the tent or my gear. I just ran. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. The forest closed in around me, branches snagging at my clothes, the underbrush clawing at my legs. All the while I could hear it behind me, the soft rustle of leaves, the faint tapping sound echoing in the night. I didn't know where I was going. The trail was long gone, and I was plunging deeper into the woods. But all I could think was that I had to get away from that thing. Eventually I stumbled upon an old cabin, more of a shack really, weathered and half collapsed. But it was shelter, and right now that's all I cared about. I flung the door open and slammed it shut behind me, collapsing onto the floor, gasping for breath. For a moment there was silence. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. Had I lost it? Then from somewhere in the trees I heard it again. That voice. That horrible, twisted voice. "Help me!" It was closer now. I could hear the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs. My heart pounded in my chest, and I pressed my back against the door, holding it shut, as if that would keep whatever was out there from getting in. And then the tapping started again, soft, deliberate, right outside the cabin door. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would go away, praying I was just imagining this whole thing. But then, from the other side of the door, I heard it whisper, in that same horrible, mimicked voice. "I know you're in there." I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out from sheer terror, because the next thing I knew, it was daylight. The tapping was gone. The forest was quiet again. I stumbled out of the cabin, shaking, barely able to process what had happened. My campsite was destroyed, my tent shredded, my gear scattered across the clearing. I didn't stick around to investigate. I grabbed what I could and made my way back to the car, refusing to look back. When I finally reached the ranger station, I was a mess, covered in scratches, out of breath, barely able to string together a coherent sentence. The ranger on duty looked at me with concern, but when I started to describe what had happened, his expression changed. His face went pale. "You're not the first," he said quietly, almost as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. "We've had reports, stories about that part of the forest. People hear voices. They see things." "Why didn't you warn me?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He looked at me, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe? Regret? "We try," he said. "But it doesn't matter. Once it finds you, it never stops." I left that day and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the tapping. And the voice asking for help. I'd always been drawn to the idea of camping, getting away from the noise of the world, finding peace in the stillness of nature. But after this trip, I'm not sure I'll ever set foot in the woods again. It started innocently enough. I'd been itching for an escape, so when my coworker Ben told me about this hidden campsite deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I was sold. He'd described it as untouched and perfectly remote, the kind of place where you could really disappear for a while. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed light and left early, arriving at the base of the trail mid-afternoon. The drive had been long, and the further I went, the less maintained the road became. By the time I reached the trailhead, it felt like I was miles away from any civilization. No cars, no people, just trees for as far as the eye could see. Exactly what I wanted. I strapped on my pack and started hiking. The trail was narrow, overgrown, and barely visible in some spots, but I wasn't concerned. I'd been given directions. Follow the river for 2 miles, then head uphill toward the ridge. Simple enough, and it was quiet. Too quiet, actually. As I moved deeper into the forest, I realized I hadn't seen or heard any wildlife. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Just my boots crunching on the dirt and the distant sound of running water from the river. After about an hour, I found the spot Ben had described. A small clearing just above the riverbank, surrounded by tall, ancient trees. It was beautiful. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the canopy in golden beams, and I could hear the river gurgling below. I set up my tent and got a fire going. It was peaceful. But that peace didn't last long. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched across the clearing, I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I laughed it off. I was alone out here, there was no one to watch me, but the feeling lingered. After eating dinner, I sat by the fire staring into the flames. That's when I heard it, the first sign that something was wrong. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling fire, but unmistakable. A soft, rhythmic tapping sound, like someone was knocking on wood. I froze, listening. The sound seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods, but it was hard to pinpoint. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't fast and it wasn't frantic, just steady, almost methodical. I turned my head, shining my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing, just trees. But the tapping continued, now slightly louder, as if it were getting closer. Probably just a woodpecker, I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. There was something off about the sound, something deliberate. The tapping stopped. The fire crackled, and I realized how loud my own breathing had become. I sat there, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. But there was nothing. Just darkness and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I tried to calm down, convincing myself it was all in my head. After all, I was alone in the middle of nowhere. My mind was probably just playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was a heavy sensation, like a pair of eyes was locked onto me from somewhere in the trees. I decided to call it a night, figuring sleep would help reset my nerves. But as I crawled into my tent and zipped it up, I felt that same prickling sensation return, stronger this time. I lay there, staring at the fabric ceiling, trying to ignore it, but it only got worse. And then there was the tapping again, louder now, unmistakably close. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. It was coming from the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the trees. Nothing. The sound had stopped the second I'd moved, but the moment I lowered the light, it started again, this time on the opposite side of the clearing. I whipped around, light flashing through the trees, but still, nothing. That's when I saw it. Movement. Just at the edge of the light's reach. A figure standing perfectly still between two trees. I froze. My hand shook as I tried to focus the beam, but the figure was gone before I could get a clear look. My mind raced. Had I really seen someone, or was it just the shadows playing tricks on me? I didn't wait to find out. Grabbing my pack, I stuffed everything I could into it, not caring about what I left behind. I just wanted to get out of there. But as I was stuffing my things into my bag, I heard something new. Not tapping this time, but a voice, a faint, distant voice calling out from the trees. Help! I stopped, my blood running cold. It sounded like a woman, weak and pleading. Help me, please. It was coming from the direction of the river, where the trees were thickest. Every instinct I had told me to run, but the voice was so desperate, so fragile. I grabbed my flashlight and moved toward the sound, my heart racing. The voice was getting closer. Please, help! I stopped at the edge of the trees, shining my light toward the river. Nothing, no one, just the flowing water and the endless stretch of trees. But the voice, it was still there, echoing through the woods, now impossibly close, yet I could see no one. Then the voice changed. It shifted, becoming lower, more distorted. Help. Me. The words sounded wrong, twisted, like something was mimicking a human voice but getting it just off. Suddenly the tapping started again, this time right behind me. I turned, my flashlight swinging wildly, but the light barely pierced the darkness. The tapping grew louder, faster, circling me now. My breathing quickened. I was surrounded by it. An invisible chorus of tapping and that awful voice, growing more inhuman by the second. And then I saw it. Between the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing, was the figure again. This time it was closer, and I could see it more clearly. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its body twisted and wrong like it had been stretched. Its face, if you could call it that, was a pale, featureless oval, and from it came that awful, distorted voice. Help me. I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted through the trees, the tapping and the voice chasing me all the way to the trail. I don't know how I made it back to my car, but by the time I slammed the door shut and sped down the dirt road, the tapping had finally stopped. I haven't told anyone about what I saw or what I heard. When I got back, I asked Ben about that spot, and he seemed confused, said he'd never been there before, never even heard of it. The directions, he said he'd never given them to me. And now every night when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear it again, faint, far away at first, but always growing closer. Tap, tap, tap. The fire crackled softly as I poked at it with a long stick, watching the embers shift beneath the logs. It was just me, alone in the middle of a remote campground deep in the woods. I had driven up here to escape the noise of the city for the weekend, a break from the ceaseless hum of life. I'd found the campground online. It seemed perfect, isolated, tucked away from the main trails, and barely visited. I wanted solitude. But now, sitting in the eerie silence of the forest, I wasn't so sure. The trees towered around me, dark shadows against the dying light of dusk. I could barely make out the outline of the trail that led back to where my car was parked, a good mile away. I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived that morning. As the night fell, the forest felt like it was closing in. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and somewhere far off, an owl hooted. I chuckled to myself, trying to shake off the nervous energy building in my chest. It's just your imagination, I thought. Being alone does strange things to the mind. After eating a quick dinner and feeding the fire some fresh wood, I settled into my tent for the night. The only sounds now were the crackling of the fire and the occasional whisper of the wind. For a while, I lay there staring up at the nylon roof of the tent, listening to the sounds of the woods, my thoughts drifting. But then I heard it, a sharp snap, a branch breaking maybe 50 yards away. My heart thudded in my chest, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I strained my ears, waiting, holding my breath. Nothing, just the wind. I shook my head. Probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. I was in the middle of a forest after all. I settled back down, telling myself to stop being ridiculous, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. There was something off about this place, something that hadn't felt right since I first arrived. The kind of silence that isn't natural, the feeling that the trees themselves were watching. I pushed the thought away and closed my eyes. Another snap, closer this time. My eyes flew open and I listened, every nerve on edge. The sound was unmistakable, footsteps, deliberate, moving through the underbrush toward my campsite. I sat up, fumbling for my flashlight, my pulse hammering in my ears. I clicked it on and shone the beam through the mesh of the tent. The fire outside flickered dimly, casting long shadows over the trees. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding weak in the silence. "Is someone there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped. I swallowed hard and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. The fire had died down, its warmth barely reaching me. I scanned the darkness, shining the beam of my flashlight over the trees, the bushes, the trail. Nothing. No sign of anyone. Or anything. I stood there for a long time, my breath clouding in front of me. Every muscle tensed. But after a while, the woods fell silent again, save for the wind. Maybe it was an animal, maybe it wasn't. I threw a few more logs onto the fire, watching as the flames leapt back to life, casting their light around the campsite. I told myself I was overreacting, letting the isolation get to me. Still, I stayed outside for a while, keeping an eye on the trees, waiting for the sound to return. It didn't. Eventually, I crawled back into the tent, leaving the fire burning brighter this time. I lay there, heart still pounding, but exhaustion was beginning to win out over fear. My eyelids grew heavy, and I started to drift. Then the whispering started. At first, I thought it was the wind again, but this was different. Soft, hushed voices, just outside the tent. Too low to make out, but unmistakably there, circling my campsite. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, frozen in place. The voices weren't human, or if they were, they weren't speaking any language I recognized. It was a strange, garbled whisper, like something from a dream. I didn't move. I couldn't move. Then the footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, moving closer and closer to the tent. My flashlight was still in my hand, but I didn't dare turn it on this time. Somehow I knew I didn't want to see whatever was out there. The footsteps circled around me, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The air inside the tent felt thick, suffocating. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop, for the night to end, for anything to make this nightmare go away. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the voices and footsteps stopped. Silence. I stayed there, rigid, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No more footsteps, no more whispers, just the crackling of the fire outside. It was hours before I dared move. When I finally did, I crawled out of the tent again, flashlight in hand. The air felt different now, colder, heavier. The trees loomed darker than before, like they were hiding something just beyond the reach of the light. That's when I saw it. Something was carved into the trunk of the tree just behind my tent. Symbols. Strange, twisting symbols that hadn't been there before. My stomach dropped as I traced the lines with my eyes, my skin crawling. Suddenly the whispering came back, louder this time, closer. I spun around, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand, but there was no one there. I knew in that moment I had to leave. I didn't care if it was the middle of the night. I didn't care about packing up the tent. I had to get out of there. But as I turned toward the trail, I froze. Standing there just at the edge of the light was a figure. Dark, shadowed, its features impossible to make out. But I could feel it staring at me, watching. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The figure wasn't standing in the light. It was part of the shadows. It wasn't something separate from the darkness. It was the darkness. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight, heart racing. The thing didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, waiting. And then, without warning, it stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, threw open the door, and sped down the dirt road, not looking back once. When I finally got home, I collapsed onto my couch, still shaking, my mind racing. I kept telling myself it was just a trick of the light, just my imagination. But then I remembered the symbols on the tree, the whispers. And then, as I reached into my pocket, I pulled out my phone. I hadn't realized I had taken a picture of the campsite earlier that evening, before everything went wrong. My heart stopped as I looked at the image. There, in the background of the photo, barely visible in the fading light, was the figure, standing between the trees. It had been watching me the whole time. It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway. Just me, my brother David, and our old college friend Sarah. We hadn't been camping together in years, and life had gotten so busy that the idea of being off the grid for a couple of days sounded perfect. No work, no phones, no distractions. Just the three of us, a campfire in the untouched wilderness. We found the spot online. It wasn't a registered campsite. Just some hidden location in the middle of the forest that a guy David knew had told him about. Completely secluded, he'd said. You won't find another soul out there. That sounded like exactly what we needed. The drive out was long and winding. The deeper we went into the forest, the more isolated it felt. The paved roads gave way to gravel and eventually to dirt. We didn't see any other cars, and after about an hour of driving on that dirt road, we found the trailhead. Everything seemed perfect at first. The air was crisp, the trees towering and ancient, their branches casting long, shifting shadows as the sun sank lower. We hiked for about 2 hours before we reached the spot, a small clearing nestled between towering pines, with a creek running nearby. It was beautiful, and exactly the kind of peaceful escape we'd hoped for. By the time we set up camp, night was starting to fall. We got a fire going, cooked some food, and sat around reminiscing about old times. The fire crackled, and the only sounds were our voices and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Everything felt right until the woods went silent. It happened so gradually that at first I didn't notice. One moment, there was the distant hum of crickets and the soft hooting of an owl somewhere far off. Then, nothing. No wind, no animals, no sound at all except the crackle of the fire. I felt it before I really understood it. The sudden weight of the silence, like something pressing down on my chest. David was mid-sentence when he stopped, his face going pale. Sarah noticed it too. We all sat there staring at each other, the firelight flickering in our eyes. "Do you guys hear that?" David finally asked, his voice low. We all listened, but there was nothing to hear, not anymore. "No," Sarah whispered. "I don't hear anything. That's what bothered me the most. The woods are never truly quiet at night. There's always something, crickets, rustling leaves, animals moving in the dark. But this was unnatural." I shrugged it off, trying to break the tension. "Maybe a predator is nearby," I said. "Animals get quiet when there's something dangerous around." "Like a bear?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. "Could be," I said, though even I didn't believe it. The stillness wasn't just the absence of sound. It was oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to push the feeling aside. We were in the middle of nowhere. Of course it felt strange. We were just being paranoid. We kept the fire going for a few more hours, but the fun had faded. We all felt it. That sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the firelight. By midnight, we decided to call it a night. I zipped up my tent, crawled into my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. The silence was deafening, my ears straining to catch any sound, any sign of life outside. That's when I heard it. A soft scraping noise like something being dragged across the ground, slow and deliberate. I froze, every muscle tensing as I listened. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It was coming from outside the tent. I glanced at my phone, 3:14 a.m. I held my breath, hoping it was just an animal passing through, but the sound didn't fade. It grew closer, more insistent, like something was circling the campsite. I quietly unzipped my tent, just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak shadows across the clearing. At first, I didn't see anything, just the trees, dark and silent. But then in the dim light I noticed movement near the edge of the woods. It was a figure, human-shaped but wrong. It was hunched over, its limbs too long and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. It dragged something behind it, something heavy, but I couldn't see what it was. My heart slammed against my ribs as I watched it move around the edge of the clearing, always staying just within the shadows, never stepping fully into the light. I wanted to scream, to wake David and Sarah, but fear kept me paralyzed. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. I just watched, my breath shallow, my body frozen with terror. The figure circled our campsite once, twice. Each time it seemed to drag its burden slower, more deliberately. I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, tried to tell myself it was just an animal, or maybe some weird trick of the light. But deep down I knew it wasn't. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its head tilted slightly, like it was listening. The silence was unbearable. And then, in the blink of an eye, it vanished. Not into the woods, not into the shadows. It was just gone, as if it had never been there at all. I lay there motionless until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. I barely slept, my mind replaying what I'd seen over and over, trying to convince myself it had been a dream or a trick of exhaustion. But when I stepped outside the tent in the morning, I knew it hadn't been. David and Sarah were already up, both of them pale, their eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Did you hear it?" David asked, his voice hoarse. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Sarah looked at us both, her face ashen. "There were footprints outside my tent," she whispered. "Big ones, and something else." We followed her to the edge of the clearing. There, in the dirt, were long, deep tracks. Not boot prints, not paws. Something else entirely. They dragged through the dirt, leading off into the woods where the figure had vanished. But that wasn't the worst part. In the middle of the clearing, half buried in the dirt, was a knife, old and rusted, with a handle worn down by time. It was covered in dark stains, like it had been buried there for years. None of us said a word. We packed up our gear in silence, moving quickly, not daring to look into the woods. We left the knife where it lay. We hiked back to the car in record time, none of us speaking until we were back on the highway, miles away from that place. Even now, I don't know what we saw, what was out there in the woods that night. But every time I close my eyes, I see that figure, hunched and wrong, dragging something heavy through the trees. And I can't stop thinking about the knife. Who left it there, and what were they dragging? Camping was supposed to be a way to reconnect, with nature, with myself, with the things that really mattered. I had been feeling disconnected from everything lately, so a weekend in the remote wilderness seemed like the perfect solution. My friend Ethan had recommended a secluded spot he'd been to once before, tucked away in a thick forest about 3 hours from the nearest town. No cell service, no noise, just pure isolation. Exactly what I needed. I arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows between the towering trees. The place was eerily quiet, with only the sound of wind whispering through the leaves and the occasional creak of branches. The campsite was small, nestled by a small lake that looked like glass in the fading light. It was beautiful, but something about the silence felt off. Still, I shrugged it off as nerves. Being so far from civilization was bound to be unsettling at first. I set up my tent quickly, not wanting to be out in the open once night fell. I built a small fire, ate a quick meal, and sat back to enjoy the peace. The sky turned dark quickly, stars peeking out through the canopy above, and the fire crackled softly as I stared into the flames. It should have been peaceful. It should have been calming. But I felt it again. That unsettling sensation, like I wasn't alone. I brushed it off, attributing it to the eeriness of the woods. After all, being alone in a forest at night messes with your head, right? It's easy to imagine things that aren't there. I kept repeating this to myself, trying to push the unease away. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the air had grown cold. I zipped myself up in my sleeping bag and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The forest was so silent that every tiny noise felt magnified. The rustle of leaves, the creak of a branch. I was acutely aware of every sound, every shift in the air, every distant rustling noise. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal scurrying through the underbrush. But then I heard it. Something soft. Something deliberate. Footsteps. I froze. They were slow, cautious, like someone trying to move quietly but unable to avoid making the slightest sound. My heart raced. Maybe it was just a deer or some other animal, but no, these were too deliberate, too human. The footsteps circled the tent, stopping every few seconds as if whoever, or whatever it was listening, waiting. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. My mind raced through the possibilities. Another camper? But I was miles away from the nearest trail. A ranger? Unlikely this late at night. I stayed perfectly still, listening as the footsteps came closer, closer still, until they were right outside my tent. I could hear the soft crunch of leaves, the faint sound of breathing. Then, nothing. The silence was worse than the noise. It pressed in around me, thick and suffocating. I waited, straining my ears for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, no sound at all. Minutes passed. I don't know how long I lay there, terrified to move, terrified to even breathe. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless, uneasy sleep. The next morning I woke up early, the events of the night still fresh in my mind. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, blinking in the bright morning light. The forest looked different in the daylight, less sinister, more peaceful, but my sense of dread hadn't faded. That's when I noticed it. The ground around my tent was disturbed. There were footprints, human footprints, leading in a circle around my tent, exactly where I'd heard the footsteps the night before. My heart pounded in my chest as I knelt down to inspect them more closely. They were fresh, made sometime during the night, but what chilled me to the bone was the size of them. They weren't just human. They were small, like a child's. I stood up quickly, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, but the woods were still, quiet. I couldn't shake the image of those tiny footprints circling my tent, the way they'd stopped right outside. I hadn't heard anyone leave, hadn't heard any footsteps retreating into the woods. Whoever, or whatever, had been out there had vanished without a sound. I debated packing up right then and there, but something in me wanted answers. Maybe it was just another camper, I told myself. Maybe I had imagined it being worse than it was. I decided to stay one more night. Just one. The day passed uneventfully. I fished in the lake, hiked a little, but that uneasy feeling never left me. As the sun set and darkness crept back into the forest, the dread returned full force. I built a fire again, but it did little to comfort me. Every crack of a twig, every gust of wind, made my skin crawl. By the time I crawled into my tent, I was on edge, my senses on high alert. I didn't know if I'd be able to sleep at all. I lay there for hours, listening to the sounds of the forest, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. It started with the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, circling the tent. But this time, there was more than one. I could hear them, light, quick steps, moving in unison around the tent. My heart pounded in my chest. I sat up, clutching the zipper of my sleeping bag, too afraid to move. Suddenly there was a soft whisper just outside the tent. Too quiet to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. A child's voice. Goosebumps prickled my skin. I sat perfectly still, straining to hear, but the whispering stopped. Then, without warning, the tent's fabric shifted. Something, or someone, was brushing against it from the outside. I could see the faint outline of small hands pressing against the nylon, moving slowly around the tent. I grabbed my flashlight, hands shaking, and clicked it on. I pointed it at the walls of the tent, but the moment the beam hit the fabric, the hands vanished. The whispering stopped. Silence. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent in a rush, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But there was no one there. Just the trees, the quiet, and the small human footprints leading away from my campsite. This time I didn't wait for morning. I packed up in the dead of night and drove until the sun came up, never looking back at the woods behind me. When I got home, I tried to rationalize it all. Maybe I'd been sleep-deprived. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me. But then, a few days later, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the trunk of my car, nestled between my gear, was a single muddy handprint. A child's handprint. We thought it was a good idea. Just a weekend camping trip, deep in the woods, far from civilization, no cell service, no distractions. Just me, Trevor, Jamie, and Kayla, a tight-knit group of friends looking for a break from the monotony of life. The trip was Trevor's idea. He'd found this place after scrolling through obscure hiking forums, a dense mist-covered forest that barely showed up on maps. It was supposed to be a hidden gem. The drive took longer than expected. As we veered off the main roads, the trees seemed to close in, swallowing the car in thick, towering walls of green. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping behind the horizon and a thin fog had begun to creep between the trees. It wasn't unusual for forests like this, or so we told ourselves. We unloaded our gear quickly, eager to set up camp before darkness completely took over. The first few hours were normal. We laughed around the campfire, roasted marshmallows, and shared ghost stories. But then, as the night wore on, an unnatural stillness settled in. The usual chorus of crickets, rustling leaves, and distant animal calls. Gone. The silence was so thick it pressed against my ears, making me uncomfortable. I didn't say anything, but I could tell the others felt it too. Kayla kept glancing over her shoulder, as if she expected something to emerge from the shadows. Trevor, always the skeptic, shrugged it off. "It's probably just the mist," he said. "Dampened sound." But the quiet wasn't the only thing wrong. The mist seemed to be moving in strange ways, swirling and coiling between the trees as if it were alive, creeping closer to our campsite in slow, deliberate waves. When Jamie went to fetch more firewood, he came back pale and shaking, though he swore he was fine. It wasn't until later, when we were settling into our tents, that the real strangeness began. I woke up in the middle of the night to the soft sound of footsteps just outside my tent. They were slow, methodical, and distinctly human. At first I thought it was one of my friends, maybe Trevor, checking on something. But when I called out, the footsteps stopped abruptly. I waited, holding my breath, straining to listen. Nothing. I stuck my head out of the tent flap, but there was no one there. Just the mist, thick and impenetrable, curling around the base of the trees. I checked the others. Trevor was asleep in his tent, snoring lightly. Kayla and Jamie, too, were tucked away. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it, until I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the campsite, standing in the mist, was a figure. It was faint, barely visible through the swirling fog, but unmistakably there. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. A deep chill ran through me, and I scrambled back into my tent, heart pounding. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was tired and seeing things that weren't there. But I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning I asked the others if they'd seen or heard anything. Kayla admitted she'd woken up to the same sound of footsteps, but Jamie and Trevor shrugged it off. "Probably animals," Trevor said. But Kayla and I exchanged uneasy looks. This forest felt wrong. Throughout the day, the sense of being watched grew stronger. We hiked deeper into the woods, hoping to shake off the unease, but no matter where we went, it felt like something was following us. Every so often I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow flitting between the trees, the faint outline of that same figure, always just out of focus. When I turned to look directly, it was gone. By the time we made it back to camp, the mist had thickened into a dense, suffocating blanket. Kayla was on edge, her usual bubbly self gone. Even Trevor was quieter than usual, casting nervous glances at the trees. That night, everything went to hell. It started with the fire. One moment it was crackling normally, the next it sputtered out as if snuffed by an invisible hand. We scrambled to relight it, but the air was thick and damp, making it impossible. The cold seeped in and the silence returned, deeper, heavier than before. Then, without warning, Kayla screamed. We whipped around to find her staring at something just beyond the campsite. There, standing in the mist, were figures, dozens of them. They were pale, ghostly outlines of people, men, women, children, all standing perfectly still, watching us with hollow, dark eyes. Trevor yelled, grabbing a flashlight and shining it at them, but the light passed right through. The figures didn't move, didn't react, just stared. And then, as if on cue, objects around the camp began to shift. Our backpacks slid across the ground, the tents collapsed in on themselves, and the air grew colder, freezing our breath in front of our faces. In a blind panic, we tried to flee, but no matter which direction we ran, the mist thickened, swallowing us whole. The trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I tripped, falling hard, and when I looked up, the figures were closer, circling us. Their faces were clearer now, twisted, distorted, as if they had been stretched and warped. Suddenly Jamie screamed, a guttural animalistic sound. His body convulsed, and then he was gone, pulled into the mist, his scream echoing through the trees. We ran, blindly crashing through the underbrush, but the figures followed, relentless, silent. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of a clearing, panting, terrified. But as we collapsed to the ground, a horrifying realization dawned on me. This clearing wasn't new. It was our campsite. Somehow we had been running in circles, and that's when I noticed the tent, our tent. But there were people inside, people who looked just like us. My blood ran cold as I watched, frozen in horror, as the version of me in the tent stirred, sat up, and looked out, directly at me. The others saw it too. There we were, all four of us, sitting around the campfire as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't us. It couldn't be. Trevor moved first, slowly approaching the doppelgangers, but the moment he stepped closer, they looked up in unison, their faces breaking into grotesque, unnatural smiles. Then, without warning, the doppelgangers stood and walked into the mist, vanishing as if they had never been there at all. The silence that followed was suffocating. That's when we heard it, the sound of footsteps behind us. Slow, deliberate. And then a voice, cold and unfamiliar, whispered from the trees, "You shouldn't have come." We never saw Jamie again. The rest of us escaped the forest the next day, though escaped isn't the right word. Something followed us out. Something wrong. I can feel it even now as I write this, watching me from the corner of the room, always just out of sight. I'm not sure we ever truly left the forest, and I'm not sure we ever will. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, a chance to unplug, get some fresh air, and finally experience the stars without the light pollution of the city. My buddy Jake and I had planned it for weeks, scouring Google Maps for the most secluded spot we could find. We finally settled on a stretch of forest about 3 hours north of the city, a place no one seemed to know or care about. It was perfect. Just trees, a lake, and silence. We left Friday afternoon, the car packed with gear and food. The further we drove, the narrower the road got, until eventually we were on nothing but a dirt trail, bumping along through the trees. There was no cell service by the time we reached the edge of the lake, just an expanse of dark water surrounded by dense, towering pines. It was quiet, eerily quiet. But that's what we wanted, right? I remember the sun was setting by the time we set up camp. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple, the kind of color you only see in the wilderness. The lake looked black, completely still, like a mirror reflecting the trees that crowded its shores. There was something about it that made me uneasy, but I pushed it down. I didn't want to seem paranoid. Besides, it was just a lake. Jake lit a fire, and soon the crackling of the flames filled the air, driving off some of the oppressive silence. We talked for a while, cracking open a couple of beers and joking about how this was the perfect spot for a horror movie. Neither of us knew how right we were. It started small, a rustling in the woods just beyond our campsite. It was subtle at first, like the wind brushing against the leaves, but there was no wind. The night was still. I glanced at Jake, but he didn't seem to notice, or maybe he was pretending not to. He was always the type to brush off weird things. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, watching. When the rustling got louder, I couldn't ignore it anymore. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. Jake shrugged. "Probably just a deer or something. Relax, man. We're in the middle of nowhere. Nothing out here but animals." But it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. Closer now. "Yeah, maybe," I said, but I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I stared into the darkness, the firelight flickering and throwing shadows against the trees. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the gloom. My breath caught in my throat. "Jake," I whispered, gripping his arm. "Look." He turned, following my gaze, but by the time he looked, the figure was gone. "What the hell, man?" Jake said, frowning at me. "You're seeing things." But I knew what I saw. Someone was out there. My heart was pounding, and I could feel sweat gathering on my forehead despite the cool night air. I tried to laugh it off, but my voice shook. Yeah, you're probably right." But I didn't believe it. As the night dragged on, the forest around us seemed to come alive with sounds. Scratching, shifting, low, almost inaudible murmurs carried on the wind. Or maybe it wasn't the wind at all. Every time I glanced at the tree line, I expected to see the figure again, standing there, watching us. But it didn't reappear. Not yet. Jake eventually climbed into the tent and passed out, but I couldn't sleep. I sat by the fire, listening to the woods, straining to catch every sound. My mind was racing, half expecting to see that figure again, half wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. Hours passed, and the fire started to die down, the glowing embers barely giving off enough light to hold back the darkness. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not in the distance this time, but close, right behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. Just the empty, silent woods. My breath was coming in ragged gasps now, and my hands were trembling. I reached for the flashlight, turning it on and sweeping the beam across the campsite, across the trees. Nothing. I turned back toward the fire, ready to tell myself I was being paranoid again. But then I froze. The tent. The flap was open, and Jake was gone. "Jake?" I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. No response. I scrambled to my feet, shining the flashlight into the tent. His sleeping bag was there, unzipped and empty. Panic surged through me. Where the hell had he gone? "Jake?" I shouted this time, my voice cracking. Nothing but the echo of my own voice bouncing back at me from the trees. The woods were so dark now, the fire almost out completely. I shone the flashlight around, desperately searching for any sign of him, but it was like he had just vanished. And then I heard the breathing. It was soft at first, barely audible over the thudding of my heart. But it was there, heavy, labored, coming from somewhere just beyond the fire's light. My pulse quickened, my body tensing. "Jake?" I called again, though I knew it wasn't him. The breathing grew louder, closer, and then I saw it. A shadow. Not Jake, not human. Something tall, its shape barely visible at the edge of the trees, watching me. Its breath rasped in the cold air, slow and deliberate. My stomach turned as I realized it wasn't alone. More shapes emerged from the shadows surrounding me, their forms indistinct but wrong. Bent, twisted. I backed toward the tent, my mind racing. I had no idea what to do, no clue what they were. Then, without warning, the closest one moved. It lunged forward faster than I thought possible, and before I could react, it was on me. I hit the ground hard, the flashlight skittering away into the darkness. For a moment, everything was a blur of shadows and cold hands, pulling, dragging. I screamed for Jake, but my voice was swallowed by the night. I was pulled toward the woods, my legs kicking, fingers clawing at the earth, and then the thing stopped. I blinked, gasping for breath, and looked up. The figures had stepped back, melting into the darkness as if giving me a chance. The fire flared for a brief second, and that's when I saw him. Jake. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his face pale, eyes wide and vacant. He wasn't moving. "Jake!" I called, scrambling to my feet. But he didn't respond. He just stood there staring at me, his mouth slightly open like he wanted to speak but couldn't. And then slowly, his lips curled into a smile, a wide, unnatural grin that split his face from ear to ear. "Come on, man," Jake's voice finally came, soft and broken. "It's your turn." That's when I realized the horrifying truth. Jake wasn't Jake anymore, and whatever had taken him was coming for me next. I've always loved the outdoors, being away from the noise, the stress, the chaos of everyday life. Camping has been my way of reconnecting with nature and, frankly, with myself. So when the chance came for a solo trip deep into the mountains, I couldn't resist. It was supposed to be peaceful, a way to clear my mind. But it ended up being the most terrifying experience of my life. The first 2 days were uneventful. The campsite was secluded, surrounded by towering pines and thick brush. The air was crisp, with the scent of damp earth, and the only sounds were the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. The spot was perfect, far from any trails or signs of other campers. Exactly what I needed. By the third night, though, I noticed something strange. I had set up my tent in a small clearing, a good distance from a quiet river. The trees were dense, making it feel like I was cut off from the world. That evening, I sat by the fire, enjoying the silence. But then I heard it, branches snapping like footsteps just beyond the tree line. I stood up, staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a deer or some other animal, I thought. Still, it felt off. Animals usually avoided humans, especially ones that made as much noise as I did. But whatever was out there wasn't shy. The footsteps came closer, crunching over leaves, deliberate and slow. "Hello?" I called out, hoping it was just another hiker, maybe someone who had wandered too far. But there was no reply. Just the sound of those heavy, slow footsteps. I shined my flashlight into the woods, but the beam only revealed more trees, stretching endlessly into the dark. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The footsteps stopped, as if whoever, or whatever it was, knew I was looking. I stayed frozen for what felt like minutes, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing. I convinced myself it was just an animal after all, maybe a large one like a moose or a bear. So I went back to the fire, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The woods, once peaceful, now felt claustrophobic. Every creak of the trees and rustle of the wind sent my senses into overdrive. I barely slept that night, waking up at every sound. At one point, I swore I heard soft breathing just outside my tent. I sat up, heart racing, but when I unzipped the flap and peered out, there was only silence and darkness. The next day I was exhausted but determined to enjoy the trip. I decided to explore further down the river, hoping to shake off the weird vibes. The air was still, the forest unnervingly quiet, but I pressed on. That's when I found it. About half a mile from my campsite, tucked between two massive pines, was an old, tattered tent. It looked abandoned, its fabric torn and dirty, as if it had been out there for months, maybe years. I crouched down to inspect it. Inside were scattered belongings, moldy clothes, a rusted lantern, a notebook half buried in the dirt. Curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped through the notebook. Most of the pages were damaged beyond recognition, but a few entries were still readable. They described someone's camping trip, much like mine. The last entry, though, was chilling. "Something is watching me. I hear it every night, getting closer. I think it's trying to get inside my tent." The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Was this a coincidence? Maybe, but it felt too close to what I'd experienced the night before. I quickly backed away from the tent, feeling exposed. The woods didn't feel serene anymore. They felt predatory. I decided to head back to my campsite and pack up. This trip was over. Whatever had happened here, I didn't want to be next. As I hurried back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing, but the sensation of eyes on me persisted. The woods seemed darker now, more sinister. When I finally reached my campsite, I froze. My tent was slashed open, torn apart like some wild animal had gotten to it. My gear was scattered, my food torn from the cooler. But it wasn't the destruction that terrified me. It was the footprints, human footprints, barefoot, leading from the tree line, circling my tent, and then disappearing back into the woods. Panic set in. I grabbed what I could, stuffed it into my pack, and bolted down the trail. I didn't care if I left things behind. I just needed to get out of there. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees as I ran. I kept hearing things, a twig snapping, a low rustle. But every time I looked back, the trail was empty. After what felt like hours of running, I finally reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and sped off, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I thought I'd left it all behind. I thought I was safe. But when I got home that night, I found dirt on my living room floor and a single footprint by the window. I never camped alone again. I had always loved camping. There was something about being far away from the city, with nothing but the quiet rustling of the trees and the crackling fire, that made me feel at peace. So when my friend Jack invited me to join him for a weekend deep in the forest, I didn't hesitate. We'd camped before, but this time felt different. He'd found a spot way off the beaten path, nestled near a forgotten lake. We arrived late in the afternoon, the golden sunlight spilling through the canopy of towering pines. The forest was dense, the air thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. No other campers in sight. It was perfect. As we set up camp, the only sounds were the birds above and the occasional rustle of the wind. By the time night fell, a thick fog had rolled in, blanketing the forest floor, creeping between the trees like ghostly fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, but I pushed it aside. Probably just my imagination. Jack was laughing, joking about the horror movies we watched too much of, and it helped lighten the mood. For a while. The fire flickered as we sat in silence, listening to the forest settle into its nighttime rhythm. The crackle of the flames, the chirp of distant crickets, and the faint whisper of the wind were comforting. But then a new sound pierced the stillness, a low guttural groan, almost like the moan of a dying animal coming from deep within the woods. Jack looked at me, his smile fading. "What do you think that was?" I shrugged, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably just a deer or something." But as the minutes passed, the sounds grew louder. Not just the groaning, but twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Someone was moving out there. And they were getting closer. I strained my ears, focusing on the sounds, but it was like whatever it was knew how to stay just beyond the edge of the firelight, concealed by the swirling fog. "We should check it out," Jack said suddenly, grabbing a flashlight. I wasn't so sure. Every instinct screamed at me to stay by the fire, but I didn't want to look like a coward. "Yeah, let's go." We stepped into the forest, the darkness immediately swallowing us. The beam of Jack's flashlight cut through the mist, but it barely penetrated the dense blackness beyond. The sound had stopped. We wandered for a while, listening, but all we could hear was our own breathing and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. Then, without warning, the air changed. It felt thicker, heavier. There was a strange smell, like something rotting, and I realized the forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no insects, just nothing. "Jack," I whispered, but he didn't respond. I turned and realized he wasn't beside me. Panic surged through my chest. I spun around. sweeping my flashlight across the trees, but there was no sign of him. "Jack!" I called out, louder this time, my voice echoing through the trees. No answer. I ran back toward the campsite, my breath quickening. The fog had grown thicker, the trees bending in ways that felt unnatural, their shadows long and distorted. Finally, I broke through the tree line, back into the clearing. The fire was still burning, but Jack was nowhere in sight. That's when I saw it. A figure just at the edge of the fog, standing completely still. It was tall, too tall to be Jack, and its limbs were unnaturally long, almost stretched. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the figure slowly turned its head toward me. Even in the dim light, I could see that its face wasn't right. Its eyes were hollow, and its skin seemed to hang off its bones like wet paper. It let out a low, guttural moan, the same sound we'd heard earlier, and started moving toward me. But not walking. It was gliding, smoothly, silently, through the mist. I backed away, nearly tripping over the fire pit, and turned to run, but as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Jack, lying on the ground, face down, his body twisted in a way that no living person could survive. But it wasn't Jack, at least not anymore. His body twitched, then started to move, slowly pulling itself upright. His head lolled to the side, and his eyes, they were gone. Just empty sockets, staring into nothingness. The figure was closer now. I could feel it behind me. Its breath, if it even breathed, chilling the back of my neck. I turned, but it was too late. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes, trees whipping past as I ran, a deep, unearthly laugh that echoed in my ears, and that same rotting smell filling my lungs. I don't know how I made it back to my car, but somehow I did. I didn't look back, not once. It's been days since then, and I've barely slept. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that groaning, feel that presence watching me. I know it's still out there, and I think it's getting closer. I always thought I was a seasoned camper. I'd been in the woods more times than I could count, both alone and with friends, and the idea of nature didn't scare me. In fact, it was where I went to clear my mind. But that all changed after last summer. It was supposed to be a quick solo weekend trip. I had found a secluded spot about 10 miles off any trail in a national forest that stretched for hundreds of miles. No campsites, no tourists, just pure wilderness. I wanted the isolation, the quiet. I wanted to escape from the noise of the city and all the stress that came with it. The first day was uneventful. I hiked most of the afternoon, found a nice clearing near a small stream, and set up camp. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back to enjoy the stillness. No cars, no voices, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was exactly what I had wanted. Around 10 p.m. I crawled into my tent, leaving the fire burning low outside, just enough light to keep the darkness at bay. I fell asleep almost immediately, the exhaustion from the hike catching up with me. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The woods were quiet, and the fire had long since died out. My small tent felt stifling, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. I thought maybe it was a sound that had woken me, something out of place. And then I heard it again, a faint, distant sound, not the usual rustling of animals, not the wind through the trees. It was singing, soft and distant, but unmistakable. It was the kind of melody you'd hear on an old record, slow and haunting, and it sent a chill down my spine. I lay there, completely still, straining to listen, convinced that I was imagining it. But no, it was real. It was faint, but getting closer. My first instinct was to rationalize it. Maybe there were other campers nearby, but I knew that wasn't possible. I had hiked deep into the forest, far from any marked trails. I hadn't seen another person all day. The singing grew louder, though it remained eerie and soft, as if carried on the breeze. I unzipped my tent just a little and peeked out. The clearing was empty. No fire, no light, nothing but the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the trees. The singing stopped. I held my breath, heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing to make sense of what I had heard. Then, from the edge of the clearing, I heard something new, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I turned off my flashlight. I didn't want to be seen. The footsteps were heavy, crunching over dried leaves and sticks. They paused every few steps, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was listening, waiting for something. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind screaming at me to do something, to run, but I couldn't move. I kept my eyes fixed on the edge of the clearing, expecting to see someone or something step out of the darkness. But no one did. Instead, the footsteps stopped and the singing resumed, louder this time, closer. It was the same eerie, haunting melody, but now it felt like it was all around me, echoing through the trees. I don't know how long I sat there listening, too terrified to move, but eventually the singing began to fade again, retreating into the woods. The footsteps resumed briefly before disappearing entirely. The silence that followed was worse. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in my tent, clutching my flashlight and knife, listening to the forest for any sign of the singing or footsteps returning. But the rest of the night passed without incident. At first light, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. My body was stiff from fear and lack of sleep, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, the memory of the singing played over and over in my mind. It was haunting, familiar, like something from a dream, and it left a knot of unease in my stomach. About halfway back, I noticed something strange. The trees looked different. Not in the way that nature changes as you move through the forest, but wrong. At first I couldn't figure out why, but then I realized the trees around me were scarred. Deep gouges in the bark, long and jagged, as if something had been dragging its claws through them. I stopped, heart racing again, and looked closer. The marks were fresh. Some of them had bits of bark hanging loose, the wounds still raw. They followed a path leading deeper into the woods, away from my route. I didn't follow them. I kept walking, faster now, my mind spinning with fear and confusion. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, safe, surrounded by the comforting sounds of the parking lot. That was the last time I went camping alone. Whatever I heard in those woods, whatever left those marks in the trees, it wasn't human. And it wasn't something I ever want to encounter again. I always loved the outdoors. There was something about the wilderness that felt honest, just you, nature, and the quiet hum of life beyond the buzzing cities. So when I found an isolated camping spot deep in the woods, far from the usual beaten trails, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. It took me hours to hike there. The forest thickened, and by the time I arrived, the trees seemed almost alive, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. It was perfect. No other campers, no noise, just pure solitude. I set up my tent near a clearing close to a small creek, the babbling water offering some comfort. The sun hung low, casting long shadows through the trees, so I quickly gathered some firewood before the forest swallowed the light completely. As night fell, the air turned cool. The crackle of the fire kept me warm, but that first hint of unease settled in my gut. It wasn't anything specific, just the feeling of being watched. I brushed it off, blaming it on the isolation. It had been months since I'd been anywhere this remote, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. Around midnight, just as I was dozing off in my tent, I heard it, a soft rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I sat up listening, every nerve in my body suddenly alert. It could have been a deer or a raccoon. I told myself that as I strained to hear over the pounding of my own heart. But there it was again, a faint crunching of leaves like footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I stepped out, trying to control my breathing, sweeping the light back and forth. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. The sound of my voice echoed through the forest, but there was no response. I stood there for what felt like hours just listening, but the forest was silent, unnaturally so. No insects, no wind, nothing, just the quiet press of the night. Reluctantly, I crawled back into my tent, convincing myself that whatever it was, it had gone. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound, every shift of the wind sent a new wave of paranoia through me. At some point I drifted off, but I woke to the feeling of being suffocated, a heavy pressure on my chest. My eyes shot open, but I couldn't move. My mind screamed, but my body was paralyzed. In the dim light of the dying fire, I saw something or someone standing at the entrance of my tent. A tall, shadowy figure, its head cocked slightly, as if observing me. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Then, as suddenly as it came, the pressure lifted and I gasped for air, sitting up and frantically shining my flashlight in every direction. The figure was gone. The forest was silent, save for the crackling remnants of the fire. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the fire, every muscle tense, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the figure didn't return. The next morning I decided to cut my trip short. This place didn't feel right anymore. I packed my gear and started the long hike back, but the trail felt different. The trees, once inviting, now seemed to close in on me. The forest felt like it was breathing, alive with something unseen. I quickened my pace, heart racing, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread that clung to me. That's when I noticed something strange. The trail was wrong. I'd been following it for hours, but instead of leading me back to the main road, it looped around. I found myself back at the same clearing where I'd camped the night before. My stomach dropped. I hadn't taken a wrong turn. I knew these woods. But somehow I was right back where I started. The fire pit I'd built was still smoldering, and my footprints from the morning were fresh in the dirt. Panicked, I grabbed my map, but it was useless. The landmarks didn't match. The trees twisted into shapes that didn't belong, and no matter which direction I walked, I kept ending up in the same place. I spent the entire day trying to escape, but the forest wouldn't let me go. By the time the sun began to set again, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and desperate. The shadows lengthened, and with them came that familiar sense of being watched. As night fell once more, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. My heart pounded as I sat by the fire, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. I knew, deep down, that the figure from last night would return. And it did. I saw it standing just beyond the firelight, tall and impossibly still. But this time, there were more of them. 3, maybe 4, each standing in the shadows watching me. I screamed, throwing rocks and shouting, but they didn't move. They just stood there watching, waiting. That's when I realized I wasn't lost. I was never lost. They had brought me here. They wanted me here. As the figures slowly stepped into the light, their faces, or what should have been faces, were wrong. They were twisted, featureless, as if someone had erased their identities. And that's when the truth hit me, hard and cold. They weren't watching me. They were waiting for me to join them. The fire flickered, and in that moment I knew there was no leaving this forest. I was already a part of it. Camping alone has never bothered me. In fact, I always found it peaceful. No distractions, no people, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the crackle of a fire. But after what happened last spring, I haven't camped since. I'm not sure I ever will again. It was a last-minute trip. I had some vacation days to use, and the weather was perfect. Clear skies and warm enough that I didn't have to worry about freezing at night. I packed light, grabbed my tent, and drove out to the cold, hollow wilderness. It's one of those places where you could hike for days and never see another soul. Perfect for someone looking for solitude. After a few hours of hiking, I found a nice spot by a small pond. The water was still, reflecting the trees and sky like a mirror. I set up camp, started a fire, and settled in for the evening. As the sun set, casting a deep orange glow across the pond, I felt that familiar sense of calm wash over me. I wasn't worried about anything. I was alone, miles away from anyone, and that was exactly what I wanted. As the night fell, I sat by the fire, sipping from my thermos and staring into the flames. The forest was quiet, aside from the usual rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. It started subtly, so subtle that at first I didn't even notice. It was the absence of sound. The wind that had been softly moving through the trees earlier had stopped. The frogs and crickets that had been filling the night with their songs had gone silent. The forest was still, unnaturally still. I looked around, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Something was wrong. I could feel it. There's a certain kind of quiet that you don't get used to, even after years of camping alone. A quiet that feels wrong. I tried to brush it off, poking at the fire to keep myself busy, but that feeling of being watched crept in, gnawing at me. I shone my flashlight into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing, just the thick trunks of the trees and the dense underbrush beyond. Then I heard it, a low, steady tapping. It was coming from somewhere in the woods, a rhythmic sound, like someone gently knocking on wood. At first I thought it was a woodpecker, but it was too slow for that, too deliberate. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the direction of the sound, but as soon as the light hit the trees, the tapping stopped. I turned back to the fire, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just an animal, I thought, something moving around in the underbrush, but the forest was still dead silent. That kind of silence that presses down on you, makes you feel like something is holding its breath. Then the tapping started again, this time closer, much closer. I turned the flashlight back toward the trees, the beam trembling in my hand, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall, too tall to be a person, and unnaturally thin. Its limbs seemed too long for its body, its arms hanging low by its sides, motionless. It stood perfectly still, its head slightly tilted, like it was watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was too dark to make out any details, but there was something wrong with the shape. Something off. The way it stood, the way it didn't move, made my skin crawl. I kept the flashlight trained on it, and slowly, very slowly, I backed toward the fire. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct in me screamed to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. As I reached the fire, I grabbed a log and threw it into the flames, sending a burst of sparks into the air. The light flared up, casting long shadows through the clearing. For a moment, I looked away from the figure, just for a second. When I turned back, it was gone. The woods were silent again, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it had grown stronger. I stood there, flashlight in one hand, the other gripping a stick from the fire, my eyes darting between the trees. I didn't see it again that night. I sat by the fire until dawn, my body rigid with fear, listening to every little sound, expecting that thing to reappear at any moment. But it never did. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and left. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I reached my car. The whole way, I felt like something was following me, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows of the trees. I don't know what I saw that night. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or my imagination playing tricks on me after too much time alone in the woods. But deep down, I know it wasn't. Something was out there watching me, and sometimes late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I still hear that tapping. Soft, steady, like a knock on wood. It's been months since that trip, and I haven't gone camping since. I'm not sure I ever will again. Because whatever that thing was, I don't think it wanted me to leave. and I'm terrified that one day I'll hear that tapping again, this time much closer. I always considered myself an outdoor enthusiast. There was something about the serenity of nature, the isolation of a remote campsite, that brought me peace. This trip was meant to be no different. Just me, a backpack, and miles of untouched wilderness. No phone, no social media, just quiet. The forest I chose this time was one I'd never been to before. Far off the beaten path, about a 5-hour drive from the nearest town. It was one of those places you hear about on hiking blogs, where people brag about the remoteness, the complete disconnect from the modern world. That's what I wanted. So, I found a clearing deep within the woods, set up my tent, and made a small fire before the sun dipped below the treetops. The first few hours were peaceful, the rustling leaves in the breeze, the crackle of the fire. But as night fell, things started to feel off. I don't know how else to describe it. The air grew colder, and the forest around me felt like it was watching, waiting. The first strange sound I heard was just after dusk, a soft, low whisper, so faint I thought I imagined it. It seemed to drift from the tree line, carried by the wind. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the trees, but then it happened again, clearer this time. A voice. Faint, but unmistakable. I stood up, scanning the woods. There was nothing, just shadows. The fire flickered, casting long, twisting shapes across the clearing, making it harder to see. I called out, a mistake in retrospect, but no one answered. My skin prickled. I felt the weight of being truly alone out here. For a moment I thought about packing up and leaving, but no. It was probably just my imagination, right? The mind plays tricks when it's quiet. Hours passed and the whispering stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes I could swear I heard footsteps. Soft, barely there, but unmistakable. They seemed to circle the tent, moving slowly, deliberately. I unzipped the tent, flashlight in hand, and stepped outside. The air was still. Too still. Even the insects had gone quiet. I swept the beam of the flashlight through the trees, but again saw nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, just silence. Then, just as I was about to head back inside, I saw something. A figure. Far off in the trees, barely visible between the trunks. It was standing perfectly still, just outside the range of my light. I could only make out its shape, tall, thin, human-like, but something was wrong. Its proportions seemed off. The limbs too long, the head tilted at an unnatural angle. I called out again, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless. I backed away, my heart racing, and ducked into the tent, zipping it up quickly. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I tried to convince myself that what I'd seen wasn't real. But it was. I don't know how long I sat there listening. The footsteps returned, closer this time, circling. Then something touched the tent, a light brush, like fingers running along the fabric. My heart pounded in my chest, my throat tight with fear. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The sound of my own breathing was deafening. And then the whispering came again, louder this time, just outside the tent. Come, out. I froze, every muscle in my body locked in terror. I could hear the voice more clearly now. It was unmistakable, like someone standing inches away from me, speaking directly into my ear. But I was alone. I knew I was alone. I must have passed out at some point because the next thing I remember, it was morning. The sun had risen and everything seemed normal again. No signs of anyone or anything around the tent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe even in daylight. I hurriedly packed up my things, eager to leave this place behind. As I started the long hike back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that something was following me. The forest felt different now, darker, even in broad daylight. I could still hear the faintest hint of whispering, carried on the wind just out of earshot. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat, though the air was cool. I threw my gear into the back seat and slammed the door, relief washing over me as I turned the key in the ignition. That's when I noticed it. In the rearview mirror, standing at the edge of the forest, was the figure. That same unnatural shape, too tall, too still. Watching. I gunned the engine and sped down the dirt road, my eyes darting between the road and the mirror. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it somehow. Still watching. Still whispering. When I got home, I tried to forget about it. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, the isolation playing with my mind. But then, last night, I woke up to the sound of whispering again. I was in my own bed, hundreds of miles away from that forest. But the whispering was the same, and this time it came from inside my room. I've always believed that the woods hold a certain kind of magic, a quiet, peaceful magic that draws you in and allows you to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life. That's why, despite my friends bailing last minute, I decided to head out for a solo camping trip. It was supposed to be relaxing, a weekend of solitude, just me and nature. I couldn't have been more wrong. I chose a spot deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, far from any popular trails. The kind of place where you wouldn't run into another soul for miles. That's what I liked about it, the isolation. I packed my gear, hiked in, and set up camp by a small creek that trickled through the dense forest. The sun was setting as I got the fire going, the woods already darkening around me. It wasn't long before I noticed the silence, not the peaceful kind, but the suffocating, heavy kind. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the crackling of my fire and my own breathing. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that maybe it was just the time of year, or maybe the wildlife was keeping its distance. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As the night wore on, I began to feel that creeping sense of being watched. It started as a tingle on the back of my neck, the kind you get when you're walking down an empty street, but somehow feel someone's eyes on you. I kept glancing around the fire, into the shadows between the trees, but saw nothing. The feeling persisted, though, gnawing at me, making me feel more and more uneasy. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, it's easy to let your mind run wild when you're alone in the middle of nowhere. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and forced myself to sleep. That's when the footsteps started. At first they were faint, soft crunches on the forest floor, like someone or something was circling my camp. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they stopped just as suddenly as they started. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, my heart hammering in my chest. There was nothing there, just the flickering remnants of my dying fire and the darkness of the forest beyond. But I could feel it. Something was out there, watching. I zipped the tent back up and lay there, wide awake, every nerve on edge. The footsteps came again, this time louder, closer. My mouth went dry, and I gripped the knife I kept by my side. I was trying to convince myself it was an animal, but the pattern of the steps, too steady, too human, sent a chill down my spine. They stopped right outside my tent. For what felt like hours, there was nothing but silence. I didn't dare move. I could hear my own heartbeat, the blood rushing in my ears, but outside, nothing. No movement, no sound. Then a soft scraping against the fabric of the tent, slow, deliberate, as if someone was dragging their hand across it. I bit back a scream, squeezing my knife tighter, waiting for something to happen. The scraping continued for a few moments, then stopped. Silence again. I didn't sleep that night. When the first light of dawn broke, I scrambled out of the tent, ready to pack up and leave as fast as possible. But when I stepped outside, my blood ran cold. The ground around my tent was disturbed. Footprints. Bare human footprints. They circled my tent over and over again, like someone had been walking around me all night, watching. I was done. I packed up my gear in record time, not caring about how neatly anything went into my bag. I just wanted to get out of there. Fast. But as I turned to head back toward the trail, something caught my eye. There was something hanging from a tree just at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't there the day before, I was sure of it. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to get a closer look. It was a bundle, a small twisted bundle made of twigs and string hanging from a thin piece of twine. It swayed gently in the morning breeze. As I got closer, I realized there was something else tied to it, something dark, almost black, dried and shriveled. My stomach churned when I recognized it. It was a finger, a human finger. Panic surged through me, and I turned and bolted. I ran faster than I ever thought possible, crashing through the woods, not caring about the noise I made or how far I still had to go. My only thought was to get out, to get away from whatever was out there. After what felt like hours of running, I finally made it back to the trailhead. My car was still parked there, the sight of it a relief that almost brought me to my knees. I threw my gear into the back seat and peeled out of there, not once looking back. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for a long time. Who would believe me? A bundle of twigs, a human finger, footsteps circling my tent in the middle of the night. It sounds like something out of a bad horror movie. But it was real. Too real. A few weeks later, I was scrolling through the local news when something caught my eye. A hiker had gone missing in the same area I'd camped. The article said he'd been an experienced outdoorsman, well prepared. But his friends found his campsite abandoned, his tent slashed open from the inside. The search parties found no sign of him, other than one thing. A small bundle of twigs hanging from a tree near his camp. I haven't been camping since, and I don't plan to, ever again. I've always thought of camping as a way to escape, a way to recharge and forget about life for a while. But what I didn't expect was that my last trip would make me question reality itself. A few months ago, I decided to head out to a remote section of the Catskills. It was a spot that a friend had told me about, far off the beaten path, where you could camp by a pristine lake surrounded by dense forest. It sounded perfect. I needed the time alone, away from work, away from people. I packed my gear, drove out to the trailhead, and started the 5-mile hike to the lake. When I arrived, the place was everything I had imagined. Beautiful, untouched, peaceful. The lake's surface was so still it reflected the sky perfectly, like a mirror. I was the only one there. No other hikers, no signs of anyone having been there in months. That's exactly how I wanted it. I set up my tent just a few feet from the shore and spent the evening relaxing by the water. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lake, I built a fire, cooked a small meal, and settled in for the night. That's when things started to feel off. The first thing I noticed was the reflection in the lake. I was sitting by the fire, and out of the corner of my eye, I caught my own reflection on the water's surface. Only, something was wrong. My reflection was sitting there just like me, but it didn't match my movements exactly. When I leaned forward to poke at the fire, it hesitated, like it was mimicking me, but with a slight delay. I stared at it for a moment, trying to figure out if it was a trick of the light or my imagination, but the longer I watched, the more obvious it became. My reflection was moving, but it wasn't in sync with me. And then it smiled. I wasn't smiling, my blood ran cold. I stood up, and so did my reflection. Again, a split second too late. The smile didn't leave its face, stretching wider than it should have. I backed away from the water, my heart racing. The reflection followed, still smiling, its eyes fixed on mine. I looked behind me, expecting to see someone, something, on the shore of the lake. But there was nothing there, just me and the darkening woods. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a weird trick of the light, maybe the ripples on the water distorting the image. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I turned away from the lake, determined to focus on the fire, to push the strange occurrence out of my mind. But then I heard a splash. It was soft, barely audible, but enough to make me turn around. There, in the middle of the lake, was something moving. The water rippled outward, slow and deliberate, as if something was gliding just beneath the surface. I squinted, trying to see what it was, but the fading light made it hard to make out any details. Whatever it was coming closer. The water lapped at the shore as the thing, whatever it was, moved toward me. And then it stopped, just a few feet from the edge of the lake, its shape hidden beneath the still surface. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the water. For a moment I saw nothing but my reflection again, still smiling, still wrong. But then, just beneath my reflection, something else appeared. A face. Pale, almost translucent with hollow sunken eyes. It stared up at me from the depths of the lake, its mouth opening slowly into a wide, unnatural grin, just like my reflection had. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The face in the water didn't move. It just kept staring, unblinking, the grin widening until it looked like the skin around its mouth might tear. I ran. I don't remember grabbing my gear. I don't remember packing anything. All I know is that I sprinted back through the woods, the light from my flashlight bouncing off the trees as I tore down the trail. I could hear splashes behind me, soft at first, but growing louder, faster. Something was following me. The whole time I kept glancing back, expecting to see the face, the thing from the lake. But I didn't. What I saw instead was something worse. It was me. Running through the trees behind me was me. Or at least it looked like me. But it wasn't right. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Its face was twisted into that same horrible grin I had seen in the water. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The thing that looked like me was getting closer, its footsteps growing louder, faster, but still wrong, too heavy, too deliberate. When I finally reached my car, I didn't stop. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and floored it. As I sped down the narrow dirt road, I caught one last glimpse of it standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. It was still smiling. I drove for hours, not stopping until I was well out of the forest. By the time I reached the nearest town, the sun was rising, and I was shaking so badly I could barely keep my hands on the wheel. I didn't tell anyone what happened. How could I? Who would believe that my reflection came to life, that something was chasing me through the woods, wearing my face? But now every time I look in the mirror, I can't shake the feeling that something is off. Just a little. My reflection is always a beat too slow, and sometimes when I turn away, I swear I see it, smiling,